Next item of business is a Conservative Party debate on motion 20415 in the name of Liz Smith in education. Can I invite those members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now. And I call on Liz Smith to speak to and move the motion. Ms Smith, please.
Thank you. On 31 occasions in the last 5 years, Scottish Government ministers have proclaimed officially in parliamentary time that education is the SNP's top priority. In those 5 years, only 6 times has the SNP chosen to debate school education in its own business time, and in 2018 and in 2019 there was no debate on schools brought forward to this chamber in SNP debating time. That, Deputy Presiding Officer, represents a very significant mismatch, just as there is a significant mismatch between some of the SNP's current rhetoric about education standards and what is actually happening in schools. And before we get thrown back at us the usual accusations from the SNP that the opposition parties are always talking down Scotland's schools, can I say this? The opposition parties have no difficulty in agreeing with the Scottish Government when it cites some of the encouraging aspects of attainment in Scottish schools. 3/4 of higher candidates passed with an A, B or a C, that a quarter achieved an A grade, that National 5 improved in 2019 after the fall in 2018, that more young people are taking advanced hires, providing, of course, they are lucky enough to be in a school or a hub that still offers them, and that the recent PISA reading score was better than the last set of statistics, even if it wasn't back to 2012 levels. Although I do wonder what the Cabinet Secretary makes of his colleague Carol Moynihan's comments about PISA, and we'll come to that a wee bit later. But what we will not do, Deputy Presiding Officer, is to agree with the SNP when it says repeatedly that Scotland's schools are producing a strong set of results and that any recent concerns about the hire are down to annual variation. The Cabinet Secretary knows fine well, and his officials know fine well, and so do our education experts across Scotland of whatever political hue, that Scottish schools are facing serious challenges, which is exactly why the opposition parties continue to use a great deal of our debating time and FMQ questions scrutinising the SNP's record on education. It is precisely because we do not feel that there has been sufficient transparency or sufficient acceptance about the nature of the challenges that our schools are facing. Serious challenges which do not sit easily with the persistent Scottish Government rhetoric that Scottish schools are consistently doing well across the board. That is plainly not accurate. Parents, teachers, young people, education experts, employers and opposition parties do not believe it's accurate. And our frustration is this. Firstly, that it has proven to be extremely difficult to get answers on some key questions. These frustrations extend to all parties on the Education Committee who concluded unanimously in recent reports that there is a complete lack of clarity over who is responsible for decision-making about the curriculum, something that we put to the Cabinet Secretary in our committee meeting on the 27th of November. To give an example, Joanne Lamont asked a question at committee on the 18th of January 2017 about who took the decision that National 4 qualification should not be externally examined and on what criteria. No answer was forthcoming. Indeed, we are still waiting. Likewise, if you go through the Education Committee transcripts over the last 2 years and the official letters which our convener Claire Adamson has had to issue to the education agencies, there have been no fewer than 9 occasions where key questions from committee members have not been adequately addressed, and the convener has had to ask the agencies again for that key information to be sent in. And on other occasions, there has been an inability of key education officers to come up with what ought to have been essential information. I cite the example on the 3rd of April 2019, when I asked a senior officer in Education Scotland about where the greatest impact on subject choice was being felt because of teacher shortages. He said he couldn't tell me. Yet surely that is a key question for our schools and for our parents. It impacts heavily on the school curriculum, on the prevalence of multi-level teaching, and we will be supporting Ian Gray's amendment this afternoon. It impacts on teacher workload and on the ability of schools to address additional support issues. And let me come to the issue of the 4-year decline in higher pass rates, which we know, thanks to FOI material, was a cause of considerable concern to Mr Swinney's own officials. It was not just an issue about annual variation, as he told us on the 6th of August. Otherwise, why would he have commissioned an investigation? The First Minister told Jackson Carlaw, just in a minute, Cabinet Secretary. The First Minister, perhaps he could answer this, First Minister told Jackson Carlaw that he should apologise for asking about this. My answer to that is why? Why on earth should he apologise? Because all Jackson Carlaw was wanting to know, like the rest of us, is what Mr Swinney's official said was the reason for the 4-year decline. And given they clearly advised him that was a problem, what was he going to do about it?
Cabinet Secretary.
The point that the First Minister was making to Mr Carlaw in Parliament last week was the fact that Mr Carlaw had suggested that there was new information produced over the Christmas break, which was the foundation of his question to the First Minister last week, when in fact I had, for a considerable period of time, addressed issues from Liz Smith herself at the Education and Skills Committee on the 27th of November. So that deals with that particular issue. But fundamentally, the question that Liz Smith, which I'm interested in hearing from Liz Smith, is what steps does she believe have not been taken to address the implications and the recommendations of the OECD review in 2015, which she supported when it was published, which have been taken as a consequence of the actions the government has taken since 2015?
Liz Smith.
Mr Swinney, I have the transcript here, and what I'm interested in is what the reasons were that your officials uncovered, the reasons for the 4-year decline in the hire. In that committee that you are referring to, I asked the Cabinet Secretary to tell us what his concerned officials believed to be the problem. I've got the transcript here. I got told about what the Cabinet Secretary and the education agencies are doing to help teachers, and I quote, better understand the standards expected of them and better support them to achieve enhanced learning. But I did not get told, neither did Jackson Carlaw get told, about what the specific problem actually was. And I ask again, is it not the case that this Parliament would be better off if we could have an assessment of what the problem is, especially as it relates to the so-called gold standard of Scottish education, and what we're going to do about it? Now, of course.
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm grateful to Liz Smith for giving way again for a second time. Essentially, the product of the... I will publish the outline of the information that was gathered as part of this exercise. I was going to confirm that in my speech. I'm happy to confirm that just now. But fundamentally, it relates to the issues that Liz Smith has cited from what I said to the Education and Skills Committee, that the conclusions of the analysis was the importance of ensuring we constantly are supporting the understanding of standards, which is what the Scottish Qualifications Authority is currently engaged in doing, as Liz Smith would expect us to do. And secondly, that we are taking steps to ensure that there is, again, the availability of support to enhance learning and teaching, which, as Liz Smith will understand, is absolutely central to the education process. And that's the work that Education Scotland, the SQA, our regional improvement collaboratives and local authorities are jointly taking forward as part of what I would ask Parliament to understand and accept is an annual exercise, well, a habitual exercise, in fact, of reviewing performance within the education system to ensure that we're addressing any weaknesses that persist.
Ms Smith, don't have concerns about your time, because it will all be made up.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm very grateful to the Cabinet Secretary, and I'm very pleased to hear that he will publish that information, because I think it's absolutely essential, particularly ahead of the review that he's commissioned for the senior phase. I think it's just a pity we didn't get that information at the time when we asked for it. And of course, what we also know, Cabinet Secretary, is that your advisers within Education Scotland are saying that there needs to be a new narrative on curriculum for excellence. Now, the Scottish Conservatives called for this as far back in 2016, and so we welcome the Scottish Government's response to the education report that there are some very serious issues to be addressed. So let me turn to this review of the senior phase. We welcome the fact that there will be a focus on some of the key issues that have been identified by the committee, most specifically on the S4 curriculum choices, on the prevalence of multi-level teaching, which we believe is as much to do with teacher shortages as anything else, and on whether the plans to regard the senior phase as a 3-year unit is in fact working in the way that was intended. In our view, and certainly in the view of most parents and employers, there remains a very strong desire for more rigour within the teaching and examination of core subjects. Subjects which, as well as maths and English, represent the arts, the sciences and the social sciences. And this has become an issue about the knowledge content and the ability of all pupils between S1 and S4, probably in S5 too, to have meaningful choices in each of these three faculty areas, not between them, so that there is a real breadth across the disciplines, as was always the main strength of Scottish education. Because whether by design or unintended consequences, a growing number of pupils, as a result of the move away to 6, maybe 5 subjects in S4 instead of 8, are finding it impossible to have that breadth. And we know from the Education Committee's survey of young people themselves, they often end up unable to take the subjects that they want and which they feel that they need. Now, the Scottish Government's response is that we should not view the modern curriculum across different year levels, but more as a block or unit across the 3 different years, namely what matters is much more available in the package between S4 and S6, and that then makes it possible to study within the faculty areas. And Cabinet Secretary, I'm not persuaded that this is working very well. And this is why, and Alistair Allen made a very good point about this in committee, because he quite rightly points to the issue about languages. And it's not a coincidence that there has been a sharp downturn in the numbers of young people taking modern languages, which, just like STEM subjects, are so crucial to the future of the economy. Alistair Allen makes the point that it's not an easy option for young people to drop a language in the early senior school and to come back to it later, because they obviously lose the essential continuity. But there is another issue here, possibly unintended, although I'm not so sure given the comments we've occasionally heard from SQA and Education Scotland, and that is in the desire to bring on board new subjects and new skills, that the pendulum has swung away from the more traditional curriculum. Knowledge-based learning has not perhaps had the focus that it deserves, and I think it's really important that we have a strong debate about this. Does that mean that we should be a little bit more prescriptive about the curriculum? Yes, I think it probably does, and I think it's important that the senior phase examines exactly this issue. And it's not about going back to an old curriculum, 5 to 14 or standard grade, but it is a case of resetting the curriculum for excellence. Because let us remember that there has been considerable concern expressed that we ended up with a curriculum design being led by the Qualifications Agency rather than it being led by teachers and curriculum specialists. And that's a serious point, because if we review the senior phase, if it's going to be fully effective, then we also have to look at broad general education and how this articulates with the senior phase. And several times in committee, Jenny Gilruth has raised this issue about the articulation. I think she's absolutely right to do so. On the 3rd of April, she asked some very reasonable and straightforward questions about National 5 courses comprising 160 hours, how effective timetabling would happen, and whether this effectively meant that there was a tension between the ethos of broad general education and what the SQA was advising was appropriate for the structure of the senior phase. And I think that's perfectly legitimate to ask that. So I hope that's something else that will be considered very carefully. Deputy Presiding Officer, Mr Swinney acknowledges, rightly, that he is ultimately responsible for decision-making within education. The public agrees. The public shares our frustration, however, that despite all the undoubted talent in Scotland's schools, we are not performing as well as we should be. A conclusion that the OECD came back to back in 2015. Mr Swinney has seen the newspaper headlines and he's read the many recent commentaries, including those from teachers on the ground, about where education in Scotland needs to improve. He must surely recognise, just like the rest of us, that there is a long way to go before Scotland can once again lead the world, and therefore be an indisputable justification for the Scottish Government to claim that Scotland's schools are producing a strong set of results. I move the motion in my name.
Thank you very much. And I call John Swinney, Cabinet Secretary, to speak to and move Amendment 20415.3. Cabinet Secretary, please.
President Officer, let me begin by thanking Liz Smith for the manner in which she addressed this subject today, which I think enables us to embark on a constructive discussion. And with just a little bit of my tongue in my cheek, I should say to her, she only needs to vote for my amendment and she'll get a government debate on education. Can I also just point out for factual accuracy, the new narrative on Curriculum for Excellence was published on the 9th of September last year. So I hope Liz Smith is aware of that, because it is material to the issues that we're discussing today. The Curriculum for Excellence is designed to fulfil a range of needs for young people, about equipping young people with the fundamental skills in literacy, numeracy and health and well-being. It's about developing the young person as a whole, their achievements and skills alongside exams or qualifications. It's about providing a wider range of options and pathways to young people through their education up to and including S6. It's designed to be flexible and can be tailored to the needs of every single young person, no matter their background, their interest, their confidence or their skill set. And it supports and promotes the highest standards of academic attainment and achievement. Now, some of the issues that Liz Smith has raised today about inserting a greater degree of prescription into the curriculum would obviously challenge some of those points that I've raised there. So there is a debate to be had as to where Parliament wishes to be on this question, because Parliament really in an overwhelming way supported the principles that I've just outlined there of Curriculum for Excellence, and has reinforced them when Parliament debated the OECD report on Scottish education in 2016, when the Conservatives supported the government's analysis of the OECD report. And let me put on the record just now that I didn't view the OECD report in 2015 as a glowing endorsement, nothing to be done about improving Scottish education. Far from it. I've spent most of the last 4 years as Education Secretary addressing exactly the recommendations of the OECD to strengthen the focus on learning and teaching, to ensure there was a clearer understanding of what was expected within the curriculum through the publication of the benchmarks, and by the simplification of the curriculum, which I accept in its formulation period was wordy and more detailed and had to be slimmed down, and we've done exactly that. Of course, I'll give way.
Liz Smith.
Taking the intervention, the Conservatives have absolutely no problem, no party in this Parliament has any problem about agreeing with the principles of the Curriculum for Excellence. What we do have a problem with, and I think many SNP members have a problem, is about the delivery. And what I'd like to ask the Cabinet Secretary is, if your officials are advising that there should be a new narrative, what do you think they actually are referring to?
John Swinney.
Well, it's actually the OECD recommended we should have a new narrative, and the new narrative essentially reinforces what for me is the central element of Curriculum for Excellence, which is about the achievement of the 4 capacities of becoming responsible citizens, effective contributors, successful individuals and confident individuals. So those 4 capacities lie at the heart of Curriculum for Excellence, and the advice that we received was to reinforce those so that that drove many of the aspects of interdisciplinary learning that are central to an effective broad general education, which I accept must be the entitlement of every young person in Scotland. So I have absolutely no desire to narrow the educational range of young people in Scotland. Indeed, I would be a vigorous defender of the principle of the broad general education being sufficiently extensive to ensure that young people are able to achieve their full potential. And I'll give way again.
Liz Smith.
Just a very brief question. Do you accept, Cabinet Secretary, that there has been a very substantial narrowing of subject choice in S4?
John Swinney.
On the hard question in relation to S4, in some circumstances, in an abstract way of looking at S4, yes, there are fewer choices to be taken in the sense that schools will have opted to present young people for 6 qualifications rather than 8. That is a judgment left to educators at local level in our school, which is one of the fundamental points of school. If Jenny Marrow would forgive me, a fundamental element of the principles of an empowered school system where we enable educators at local level to make the judgments most appropriate for young people. So that's in an abstract sense on S4. But Liz Smith correctly explained my position, which is I believe the senior phase is a 3-year phase in which the achievements of young people should be assessed at the end of that process, not at one intermediary stage at the end of stage 4. I will in one moment, but let me just address one final point that Liz Smith raised with me, which is about this balance between knowledge and skills within the curriculum. I think we're all agree. I can't imagine there's a single person in this Parliament that doesn't believe education needs to be founded by the acquisition of knowledge and the acquisition of skills. I completely accept that position. My view is that that balance is correct within Curriculum for Excellence, although I am always open to debate about that question. I don't think it's a question of us, as it's often put to me by some of commentators from south of the border, that we need to have a knowledge-based curriculum rather than a skills-based curriculum, because if it's an either-or choice, I don't accept that, because young people need to be equipped for a constantly changing world. I'm happy to give way to
Jenny Mara.
Secretary for giving way. I take issue with his assertion that this is abstract or limited to a school's discretion. In Dundee City Council, they are mandated at S4 that no school offers more than 6 subjects by the local authority because of the cuts, because they can't afford to teach more than 6 subjects. What does he say to that about school discretion?
John Swinney.
I'm enthusiastically and energetically supporting the empowerment of schools to enable schools to be able to take those decisions. And local authorities, local authorities around the country have taken different positions and left different levels of discretion to individual schools. And as we work our way through the empowerment agenda, it's about putting the control back into the hand. In my view, the importance of putting the control into the hands of educators to enable them to take those decisions at local level. I'm afraid Mr Finlay will have to forgive me, because I'm going to have to cover a bit more ground in my speech. Now, there's a whole host of information about performance that I would like to put on the record about improvements in achievement of curriculum for excellence levels, about the closure of the attainment gap, about the qualifications that have been achieved by young people, and I'll come back to some of those points in my comments at a later stage. But let me address some of the issues in relation to the heart of the Conservative motion about a review of the broad general education. This is where I say to Parliament we've got to be careful what we support today. We undertook in 2015 a review of the broad general education, which commanded wide support within this Parliament, produced by the OECD. We are in the process of implementing those recommendations. Now, in the remit for the senior phase review, which we've committed to undertaking, and which I've consulted the Education Committee about the remit, and I'm coming to conclusions about that remit, one of the issues we will look at is the articulation and transition between the broad general education and the senior phase, because the achievements of what's expected of young people in the broad general education, I think, are crystal clear. They are encapsulated in the benchmarks that are available to all schools across the relevant curricular areas, and which set out what we expect young people to be able to have an experience of before they embark on the senior phase. Now, the OECD completed a comprehensive review for the broad general education as a whole in 2015. They produced a 176-page report, and we've been working with partners in taking forward the recommendations from that review about improving assessment, about strengthening standards through the development of benchmarks, and developing a refreshed narrative for curriculum for excellence. I do not think this is the moment to revisit the broad general education, other than in relation to the relationship between the broad general education and the senior phase, which is an issue of transition that we will look at in the senior phase, but I don't think it merits a separate broad general education review at this stage, given the fact that we've already tested these issues in 2015. So I genuinely invite the Conservatives to support the amendment that I've put forward, which enables us to address this issue. I'm happy to give way to Mr Mundell if I'm
very, very quickly, as long as it's a quick answer and a quick closure.
Thank you, Deputy President. It was simply to ask, if it's 5 years on since that review, is it not worth seeing whether or not we've managed to properly address those points or not?
John Swinney.
But the transition issues are the ones that the Parliament's asked me to undertake a senior phase review, and I've agreed to do that. And the transition issues between the broad general education and the senior phase are, to me, the issues that we need to satisfy ourselves on, having just relatively recently undertaken a review of the broad general education. And if Mr Mundell will allow me to complete the point, he will appreciate that change in the education system does not happen instantaneously. And a 5-year period is a relatively short period educationally within which for us to see the development of progress. So I invite the Conservatives in the course of this debate to reflect whether it is necessary and justifiable for us to have another review of the broad general education, having just completed such an exercise and are currently implementing that exercise. Presiding Officer, the Government believes that there is important progress being made within Scottish education. Performance is increasing. That is being independently validated. We've seen the evidence of that. We are open to the challenge about the necessity of strengthening and improving Scottish education. That is what I spend my time trying to deliver, and I invite Parliament to support the amendment that I've put forward, which gives us a coherent way of addressing these issues, but not in a way that disrupts the Scottish education system.
I now call Ian Gray to speak to and move Amendment 20415.2. 7 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. So it's a new year, indeed a new decade, but here we are, still dependent on opposition time for a debate on schools and education. Not only 2 parliamentary years, but Liz Smith is right, 2 full calendar years have passed since the Scottish Government have seen fit to bring their policy and performance with regard to schools to this chamber for debate. And after all this time, to bring forward a government amendment promising a debate sometime soon is just a bit pathetic. It is certainly too little, too late and too vague. And this reluctance to debate school policy has a certain irony about it too, because the Cabinet Secretary is absolutely right. There is widespread agreement around the principles of Curriculum for Excellence. The principles of CFE have commanded broad and enduring support, including cross-party support, throughout the years. But that is exactly because they emerged from a comprehensive, open national debate launched by Cathy Jimison 19 years ago and engaging across Scottish society and indeed beyond. The strength of Curriculum for Excellence has always been this breadth of support for its principles. Its weakness, however, has been in its implementation. Being implemented in a period of sustained cuts to resources and to teacher numbers, causing enormous strain on teaching staff and creating distortions in the curriculum. And that has been exacerbated by the very late introduction in policy making, back before the time the SNP were responsible for this, but the very late introduction in policy making of the 3-year general education phase, which did not emerge from that national education debate. And then later, and this is once the SNP had taken over stewardship of our education system, later by the reform of the exam system, something which, as Larry Flanagan of the EIS made clear in evidence to the Education Committee, was not a requirement of Curriculum for Excellence, and which has struggled to fit with it. And the consequences of all of this, unintended perhaps, but consequences nonetheless, have been laid bare in the report of the Education Committee on subject choice and the evidence behind it. Pupils are able to choose fewer subjects to study to exam level, narrowing the breadth of curriculum of which the Scottish school system has always been so proud, and squeezing some subjects, if things go on as they are, out of the curriculum altogether. Secondly, the teaching in a single class.
John Swinney.
I'm grateful to Mr Gray for giving me. Would he accept the evidence that I presented to him in the Education Committee, that in that 3-year senior phase experience that I recounted, that I've covered with Liz Smith today, there are opportunities for young people to study and to complete more certificated qualifications than when Mr Gray and I were at school, because of the nature of approaching that as a 3-year phase, which provides wider opportunities for young people.
But what matters is not just the studying of subjects, but the level to which pupils are able to study them. All the evidence that the Education Committee received pointed to a narrowing of what it was possible to achieve within one's school year. And I mean, I know that let me come back to that in a second. Secondly, the other consequence, of course, is that the teaching in a single class towards exams at 2, 3 or even 4 different levels has become endemic, and in some schools the norm. Now, the Education Secretary's response to these problems, and I think he's just demonstrated that, has not been an open one. He first denied altogether that subject choice was narrowing at all. He then diverted to claiming that pupils could choose from a wider range of courses, a different thing altogether, as he well knows. And today, he dismissed these concerns about the narrowing of the curriculum by saying that the narrowing was only an abstract narrowing. What on earth does that mean? If you're a pupil in school and you can do fewer exams, that is not abstract, it is real for pupils who get one chance at school and one chance only. Surely.
John Swinney.
The point I was making to Liz Smith is about the difference between looking at one individual year, which is S4, and a 3-year senior phase, because Mr Gray is wrong that young people cannot study for qualifications at different levels if they participate in a 3-year senior phase, and they may do 6 National 5s in S4, but they can do other National 5s at other stages in their senior phase if they choose to do so.
Ian Gray.
I understand that that is the theory, but the evidence the committee received is that it is not the reality. And if you look in particular, for example, at modern languages, we were given very specific evidence that it is not, in fact, the reality. And as for multi-level teaching, the government's claim is that this has always happened, which is simply not true, except in the case of standard grade, and those were courses specifically designed for that style of teaching. The truth is, not one shred of evidence has been presented to the committee that multi-level teaching is desirable for educational reasons. All the evidence is it's covering for a lack of teaching resources. And only this week, Professor Yellowlees of the Learned Societies has written of their concerns about the damage multi-level teaching is doing to STEM teaching. You know, government claims that what matters is outcomes, yet they have dismantled the long-term statistical runs of performance data we had by abolishing the Literacy and Numeracy Survey and by pulling out of some of the international surveys as well. National standardised tests have proven to be neither national nor standardised, so we're left with PISA scores and exam results. And PISA scores show literacy scores 22 points lower than they were 20 years ago, and maths and science performance the worst it's been since PISA began. Meanwhile, pass rates, as Liz Smith said, have declined for the past 4 years in a row at higher. Now, worst of all, these unintended consequences, the implementation of curriculum for excellence, are not uniformly felt. The evidence is that schools in deprived areas are more likely to limit the number of subjects which can be studied, while the educationalist James McKennany recently demonstrated that schools in the most affluent, high-performing areas generally avoid multi-level classes, while elsewhere all schools have such classes. And in Dundee, for example, nearly 60% of senior phase classes are multi-level. Any dispassionate consideration of the evidence has to conclude that for all the great work that goes on in schools and the efforts of teachers and pupils, they are being held back by the structure of the curriculum and the use of multi-level teaching, and that an insidious gap is developing to the disadvantage of those who face the greatest barriers anyway, quite at odds with the government's sincerely held policy of reducing that inequality. The result, then, is a slow but significant decline in some critical aspects of attainment. And until the Cabinet Secretary accepts that and accepts the need to address it, and acceptance his amendment this afternoon quite specifically removes from the motion, then we will struggle to have confidence in the forthcoming review. I support the motion and move the amendment in my name.
Now Colin Ross-Greer for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In November, I asked the First Minister when the Government would bring a debate on school education. At that point, it had been almost to the day 2 years since the last Government debate on what's happening in our schools. Their avoidance of debate on what they declare themselves to be their defining mission should be a cause for self-reflection in this Government, as should the fact that these issues have only been aired and voted on due to the opposition parties. More than 2 months after I asked that FMQ, no government debate on school education has come forward. But today we have the frankly bizarre scene of the Deputy First Minister using an amendment to an opposition motion to announce that there will be one at some point this spring. And I'm going to be generous and assume that there will be one this spring, regardless of whether or not the government amendment is agreed to. Not happening, Deputy First Minister. If this is how things work now, though, I would appreciate if Mr Swinney could this afternoon confirm when the debate after that will be, or maybe the one after that as well. Because after 2 years of avoidance, it seems only reasonable that the government catch up with public demand for us to grapple with these issues. When will they bring forward debates on the crisis and additional support needs provision, on teacher recruitment, retention and workload, or the performance of the SQA in Education Scotland? Ask these questions sincerely. On some of these issues, we can find common ground, and we have done in the very recent past. But whether or not they'll be defeated in the final vote should not be the government's primary concern. Given the uncertainty over our next opportunity to discuss them, I'd like to touch on a number of these issues today, but of course starting with those referenced in Liz Smith's motion. Last September, the Education Committee published our report on subject choice in schools. We agreed to undertake this inquiry because despite investigations both by journalists and academic analyses on narrowing subject choice and its apparent link to deprivation, the public bodies responsible were simply not taking the issue seriously. We tend to talk about two issues interchangeably when we talk about subject choice and availability: the number of subjects that students can take at any one time and the number on offer to them from which they can select. These are separate, but they are related issues, and they were both covered during the committee's inquiry. There's clear evidence now that the curriculum has narrowed in S4 at the start of the senior phase, with what appears to be a link between the relative affluence of an area and the number of National 5 courses which can be taken, for example. And of equal concern is the evidence of restrictions in subject availability at higher level, which seem to map even more clearly against deprivation levels. S5 and S6 pupils in poorer areas simply have fewer hires to select from. This has come about despite greater choice and opportunity in Scottish education being a key goal of Curriculum for Excellence when it was first developed. It looks like implementation has achieved the opposite in some areas. But what was particularly clear from the committee inquiry into subject choice is that we've barely scratched the surface. A range of lingering problems remain with the implementation of Curriculum for Excellence. There's a distinct lack of clarity in Scottish education over who is responsible for issues like subject availability, for example. And there's certainly continuing confusion over the role of Education Scotland, who failed to provide adequate support for the implementation of CFE. One defining theme of not just this inquiry, but the 3 years now that I've been on the Education Committee, has been Education Scotland's desire to shirk all responsibility and refusal to acknowledge that problems even exist. I've repeatedly been left wondering what they're actually responsible for once you discount everything that they have tried to disown. This lack of clear responsibility and ownership has led to inconsistencies in the structure of the curriculum, with some schools essentially continuing the 2+2+2 model of the previous structure, rather than 3 to 15 BGE in the 3-year senior phase of Curriculum for Excellence. And the disconnect between Education Scotland and the SQA was particularly striking. Neatly encapsulated. Yes.
John Swinney.
I'm grateful to Mr Greer for giving me. I wonder if he would give me his opinion on whether he thinks it should be prescribed that our schools should operate a 2+2+2 model or a 3 to 15 model.
Ross Greer.
I'm grateful for the Deputy First Minister asking that question because it relates directly to the point that I'm about to raise on the disconnect. The questions we task here are about the inconsistencies in the current structure before we move ahead to resolving them. Because of that disconnection, we have a situation where one government agency is responsible for deciding how many Nat5s it is possible to take, whether or not there's a cap, whether or not there's a minimum threshold, and the other is responsible for setting the 160-hour course requirement. That resulted, during the course of the committee's inquiry, in entirely incoherent responses as to whether the 160-hour course requirement was once you begin the senior phase, or whether that began before the senior phase does, and thus moved in to the BGE. We don't have a situation where there is clarity of distinction between those two areas. If the Deputy First Minister would like to come back in.
John Swinney.
I'm grateful to Mr Greer again. I'm not asking Mr Greer to give me an opinion on one or the other. I'm interested in whether he thinks that should be prescribed by the government.
Ross Greer.
The point I'm trying to make here, Deputy First Minister, is that when the Curriculum for Excellence was developed in the first place, we had a broad national conversation and reached an area of consensus. I'm not minded towards prescription, but I want us to actually identify the problem and address seriously whether or not there is another solution. If there is another coherent solution, that is what I would be minded towards. But until the government can concede that there is a problem, how can we possibly debate what the solutions actually are? And this is where it comes back to political accountability and our ability to actually debate and discuss these issues in Parliament. Because the lack of leadership in the implementation of Curriculum for Excellence is something which the Scottish Government is ultimately responsible for. So the Greens welcome the senior phase review, and the indications that its remit will be wide enough to encompass the issues that have been raised, particularly about subject availability and deprivation. I'd welcome unambiguous confirmation from the Government that that specific issue, the link with deprivation, is going to be examined. But equally, we're clear that these issues can't be examined in isolation. The implementation of Curriculum for Excellence took place and continues to take place in a period of austerity. That is something that needs to be acknowledged. And again, that comes back to the role of Education Scotland, something that was raised with them repeatedly in committee sessions, whether or not it is actually possible in the course of, for example, their inspections, to acknowledge the financial reality and the impact that that is having on subject choice or availability, on teacher recruitment and retention. If we continue to address these issues in silos, if we address them at all, there will not be a coherent response. So I hope the senior phase review can succeed where Education Scotland have often failed in even being able to acknowledge these issues. And to close, Presiding Officer, I hope that we will be back here soon enough to continue this incredibly important debate.
Beatrice Wishart, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The Education and Skills Inquiry into Subject Choice in Schools is an important one. It offered the opportunity to share across the country some of the innovative work happening in curriculum design. It highlighted some unintended consequences of the implementation of Curriculum for Excellence, and where teacher shortages, lack of resources and a confused chain of accountability are creating a postcode lottery of opportunity. I agree with many of the points that have been raised in the Chamber today with Liz Smith and Ian Gray, and I do welcome the review into the senior phase as well. I want to use my time, though, to highlight concerning evidence that came from the committee's inquiry, which I believe has not been fully addressed. Page 60 of the committee report states that it is the unanimous view of the committee that there is continuing confusion around the responsibilities of Education Scotland, and that is failing to provide adequate support for the continuing implementation of Curriculum for Excellence. Education Scotland describes its role as, I quote, to support improvement, to provide assurance to parents and other stakeholders about the quality of education, and to provide evidence-based advice to ministers. Last April, committee learned that Education Scotland holds worryingly little information on a number of key areas. On teacher numbers, representatives said, quote, it is not our responsibility to know about teacher numbers in school. On the number of pupils taking short courses, another representative said, quote, Education Scotland does not keep that information. On the reason behind the fall in pupils taking languages, we heard, quote, it would be interesting to find out whether pupils do pick languages up later. However, I do not have the data. On the number of multi-level classes that Labour's amendment highlights, Education Scotland has no view on the consequences, and they do not keep information on its prevalence. On consortia arrangements, it's done no equality impact assessment, despite calling that a good thing. Deputy Presiding Officer, that raises serious questions about Education Scotland's competence. These are substantial policy areas with potentially serious repercussions. For example, in response to a survey held as part of the Subject Choices Inquiry, one pupil told the Education Committee about the consortia arrangements they were working with. They said, and I quote, this year is my advanced higher year, and I'm having to sit 2AH physics and chemistry at the neighbouring school, while my third is AH maths, which I am teaching to myself. I have had to take an extra higher just to have any subjects at all in my own school. Yet without any impact assessment, Education Scotland are certain that consortia are a good thing, but I'm struggling to see how that conclusion can be justified. Staff working in Education Scotland are doing a lot of good work to drive improvement. Yeah.
John Swinney.
I wonder if Beatrice Wishart is going to reflect on all of the issues that she's raising, on the relevance and responsibility of the local authority that she is raising about their statutory obligation to deliver education.
Beatrice Wishart.
The local authority are obviously mandated to do through the policies that are coming through from Education in Scotland and from the government. So, if I can...
John Swinney.
I'm simply making the point that the statutory responsibility for the delivery of education at local level lies with a local authority. That is what the law says. And that's, well, it's the truth. It's simply a fact. And I'm simply asking if Beatrice Wishart will reflect on the role of local authorities in delivering that education at local level.
Beatrice Wishart.
But the advice is coming from Education Scotland, and that's what they are putting in place. And so without any... so staff working in Education Scotland are doing a lot of good work to drive improvement in our schools. But by replacing the SSLN with the SNSAs, the government's already created, perhaps unintentionally, a data gap. And in the context of that black hole of understanding, the body overseeing the implementation of the curriculum must have a better understanding of the policies it's recommending, because there must be responsibility and accountability. The Quango is marking its own homework. It sets both the Scottish Government's policy and carries out inspections. There's a fundamental conflict of interest, and Liberal Democrats don't trust this arrangement. Only 28% of Education Scotland's own employees said they have confidence in its leadership. Presiding Officer, this isn't the first time that Education Scotland's competence has been questioned. In a Lib Dem debate in 2017, the Parliament voted for serious consideration to be given to separating the inspection and policy functions of Education Scotland. But there's little evidence that any serious consideration was given to this by the government. On a similar note, the Parliament voted to cease standardised testing, so I'm disappointed to see the government fall back on the OECD report of 2015 as a justification. That view has since been called a misinterpretation of the report by experts. I hope that the government will not attempt to reassert that misinterpretation when the government hold their first debate on education in front of the OECD in spring. Surely the evidence presented to the Education Committee from pupils, parents, teachers, academics and officials, alongside Scotland's worst ever PISA results in science and maths, means it is time for the government to reconsider its opposition to re-establishing separate policy and inspection bodies.
That concludes the opening speeches. We move to the open debate. Speeches of up to 6 minutes, please. I call Claire Adamson to be followed by Alison Harris.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to speak in today's debate. As the convener of the Education and Sales Committee, I'm very proud of the work that the committee undertook in this area and agree that we produced a consensual report that reflected concerns that had been raised in the media regarding subject choice. It's a robust report which asked the government to undertake an independent research on the senior phase from 3 to 6 years of the Curriculum for Excellence, and the government agreed to the committee's ask. I'm therefore surprised and indeed more than disappointed at the motion before us today, which seems to seek to preempt the work that has been done by the government to understand better this phase. I said it was a robust piece of work. Had we been able to show conclusively that the outcomes of young people were being significantly damaged by the senior phase, that would have been in the report. We did not get to that conclusion, and we did not see evidence that supported that. I will take an intervention.
Liz Smith.
I'm grateful to the convener of the Education Committee for taking an intervention. I entirely support the work that she's done on this, but I'm sure she will agree, not least because it was a unanimous decision, that there are serious questions that we were asking at committee and they weren't being provided with answers by the education agencies. Would she agree that that is part of the issue?
Claire Adamson.
I would agree that the committee's work in this was robust and that those answers should be coming forth. But nonetheless, the main thing was to establish a review of the senior phase to understand what the impact is on young people and to look at the various different curriculum models and see what was happening. But we have to look at that in the context of outcomes and recognise the positive evidence that the committee took in relation to Curriculum for Excellence. And without, what we did show was there was a narrowing in some schools on S4, but in that in itself was damaging and limiting the ambitions of the young people we have yet to establish. And that's what the review will show for us, because when we look at the outcomes and we look at the Office of National Statistics results for the destinations for leavers, we're seeing an increase in the benefits to our young people. In Leaver Destinations in June 2019, published in 2019, saw that 93.2% of our young people were in positive destinations. That's up from 85.2% in 09-10.
Ian Gray.
Will the member accept that as long as that statistic counts work in 0 hours contracts as a positive destination, it is not worth the paper it's written on?
Claire Adamson.
Mr Gray, this has been raised before, and I know that the government is undertaking to look at the issue of 0 hours contracts in that context, but it also shows that the numbers have increased in pupils going on to further and higher education destinations. And that's really important. The number of people that have gone on in higher education has increased to 39% from 34.2% in 09-10. That's an increase in our young people going on to an articulation route that could take them on to degrees and professions. It also shows an increase in young people going into the workplace. If we are continually painting a picture of a failing education system, we are doing an injustice to our young people and their schools and the hard work of our teachers. And I know that the issue of teacher numbers has been raised. I'm not going to take another intervention, sorry. The issue of teacher numbers has been raised, but the Scottish Government have taken action on this, and we must recognise that there is an increase in the number of teachers. The teacher-to-pupil ratio is higher in Scotland than it is in any other part of the UK, and also the work that has been done to ensure that we have teachers in areas where we are struggling. So the STEM bursaries that were introduced, which offer career changes to people coming in to teach in STEM subjects, has been greatly oversubscribed, and people are looking to do that. And they're supporting the initiatives of universities to develop alternative routes into teaching for STEM subjects. So nothing is being done in a vacuum, and no one is standing still as we examine how Curriculum for Excellence is working and progressing in reality. I was absolutely delighted to attend a visit to Braidhurst High School in my constituency with the Deputy First Minister last week. Braidhurst has a challenging catchment area. It's a North Lanarkshire area, and it also is very proud to be one of the Scottish Football Association performance schools, where pupils talented in football have an opportunity to undertake intensive training alongside their school studies. What was absolutely clear from the visit was that those participating in the SFA Academy had instilled in them a personal discipline, a resolve that was carried into the ethos and the life of Braidhurst as a whole. Indeed, the SFA team captain was also a house captain at the school. Curriculum for Excellence had enabled the training to be timetabled in a column of choice to limit the impact of the football training on the academic subjects chosen by the young people. It was an example of Curriculum for Excellence working absolutely in partnership with the school. And it also, in all of these debates, we have to recognise developing the young workforce. And I was delighted that two of the captains who took me on the tour of the school wanted to talk to me about their foundation apprenticeship in digital media that they were undertaking at the local college. And it was an example of how this is all working together. When skills and achievements in the final phase that build capacity in young people and equip them for the world of work, such as Duke of Edinburgh Awards, volunteering and team building, and foundations apprenticeships, if they're not seen in the same category as some of the academic subjects, then we are doing not only a disservice to our pupils and our hard-working teachers, but also to the principles of the Developing the Young Workforce programme and the Wood Commission, something that was also consensually signed up to all of the parties in this chamber. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Alison Harris, followed by Jenny Gilruth.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. In recent years, it has become increasingly apparent that the delivery of the Curriculum for Excellence is in need of reform. and today's motion mentions key weaknesses in some key aspects of Scottish school education. One of the most prominent issues is the fall in attainment at Scotland's gold standard, the higher, that we have witnessed over the last 4 years. In 2016, the proportion of A to C grades was 77.6%. Each year since, it has fallen, until 2019's percentage stood at 74.8%. Whilst I agree that single-year figures can vary, the sustained trend is the concern here. Because if it continues unaddressed, then within the next 10 years, we will have seen a 10% drop from 2016. What is quite unhelpful is the rhetoric used by the SNP when these figures are announced. For example, they often bring up the number of pupils achieving at least one higher pass. But Reform Scotland's Commission on School Reform recently said that there is no explanation for the SNP's continued use of this measure. They said, and I quote, "One higher pass does not seem to give access to opportunities in further or higher education that are not open to people without such a pass." An ongoing issue with Scotland's education system is the lack of system-wide data. In the last decade, the SNP withdrew Scotland from international surveys such as the Third International Mathematics and Science Survey and the Progress in International Reading Literacy Study. This was followed by the scrapping of the Scottish Survey of Literacy and Numeracy. And I know that the SNP MSPs will say standardised assessments provide us with more data than ever. But this is not quite accurate. Yes, maybe these assessments provide teachers with diagnostic information which they can use to inform individual classroom decisions. But in terms of evaluating the education system, the Commission on School Reform said they have done nothing to improve the quality of information available. I think it would be worth considering one factor which was raised on several occasions in the Education and Skills Committee inquiry into subject choice. That was the disconnect between the Broad General Education, or BGE, and the senior phase of senior school. There needs to be more transparency about this disconnect. These two phases do not sit alone, and yet they are not complementing each other. That is why the motion is right to call for a review into BGE with a particular focus on how it articulates with the senior phase. One of the concerns arising from this disconnect is the reduction in the number of subjects pupil can take in S4, and through that, the increase in the use of multi-level teaching, where different levels of education are combined into a single class, a problem that has been exacerbated by teacher shortages. Education Committee witnesses discredited this form of teaching, with Larry Flanagan, EIS General Secretary, saying, "I do not think anyone on this panel would defend multi-level teaching in any subject area." And I know SNP MSPs are getting ready to tell the Chamber that multi-level teaching has been a long-standing part of Scottish education. But that is not what I'm talking about. I'm discussing the recent explosion in its usage. It is one of the biggest complaints that the senior phase that the EIS receives from its teacher members. This is reinforced by the Learned Societies groups on Scottish STEM education, who wrote to the Education Committee saying that multi-level teaching was a prominent issue for the teaching of the sciences. They said that science teachers have expressed concern that this does not allow them to fully support the needs and aspirations of pupils undertaking different levels of national qualifications. So here are the facts. The EIS General Secretary has said that teachers are concerned by the recent explosion in the use of multi-level teaching. Science teachers say these combined classes are prominent and do not support the needs and aspirations of pupils. And finally, whilst I accept we cannot use PISA solely as a guide, the fact is Scotland has now fallen to a record low of 29th in the science rankings. Deputy Presiding Officer, surely there has to be a link between these factors and these facts that any future review into BGE should examine. As Liz Smith said in her opening remarks, often when we come to the Chamber highlighting the areas that need worked on, the Scottish Government tell us that we are talking Scotland's schools down. All the while, the same Scottish Government, in a quiet panic, are asking their own officials what is going on. Constructive criticism and debate must not be stifled. Now is the time for honesty and transparency from the Scottish Government about our education system's weaknesses. Weaknesses cannot begin to be addressed until there is an open acceptance that they exist. So it's time the Scottish Government took off the blinkers and did just that, so that we can all work together, because I do not doubt that we are all seeking the very best for Scotland's children. Thank you.
Jenny Gilruth, followed by Jenny Mara.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As we've heard, the Parliament's Education and Skills Committee undertook a robust inquiry into subject choice last year. And for context, the committee noted its support for the ethos and the principles which underpin Curriculum for Excellence and the work being undertaken to develop the senior phase. Presiding Officer, one of the key drivers of Curriculum for Excellence was a localised approach which would best suit the needs of learners in that area. Horizontal management as opposed to top-down vertical structure. Empowerment, as the Cabinet Secretary described it earlier. Indeed, as the OECD report noted in 2015, CFE needs to be less managed from the centre and become more dynamic, a highly equitable curriculum being built constantly in schools, networks and communities with a strengthened middle in a vision of collective responsibility and multi-layer governance. The committee considered articulation between the broad general education and the senior phase. And as Liz Smith noted earlier, this was an issue that I explored with witnesses. Whilst I was reassured by the Cabinet Secretary today mentioning that articulation is being considered by the senior phase review, it is worth noting the historical challenges which have always existed in this area. Indeed, as Tony McDade from South Lanarkshire Council advised the committee, the learning that took place in the history class in first year did not necessarily connect to the standard grade experience or indeed the higher experience when different skills were involved. And as was noted by the Government's amendment today, direct action has been taken to reduce teacher workload. The removal of outcome and assessment standards, for example, has been a key change. And I know from my former Nat 5 Modern Studies class, I had responsibility for tracking 390 individual assessments. That was just in one class in 1 year. That workload has now been removed following the Cabinet Secretary's instruction, and it was warmly welcomed by our hard-working teaching population. In terms of the numbers routinely available for pupils to choose from at National 4-5 level, the committee did hear of some variance nationally. But much like articulation, this variance is not new and has existed under standard grade. Fundamentally, however, as Professor Jim Scott advised the committee, on schools offering 6, 7 or 8 qualifications, assuming that the child manages to carry forward 5 subjects, they will be able to get 5 hires. That is where our focus should be as parliamentarians, Presiding Officer, on equality of opportunity to succeed. Additionally, of course, we must be cognizant that subject choice is driven by the learners themselves. Pupil uptake has always been a driver of subject availability. Indeed, in 2015, I had 2 pupils who wanted to study Advanced Higher Modern Studies. I wanted to teach them the course. But the course could not run with 2 pupils present. And I would suggest to the Conservatives that nor should it have. As a faculty head on a good salary, it would not have been the best use of taxpayers' money to pay me for 5 periods a week to teach 2 pupils. Instead, those pupils attended the course at another local school, and which was able to justify its delivery due to their uptake. Curriculum for Excellence has undoubtedly evolved since its inception. New pathways now exist now. Yes, I will.
The idea that pupils can be facilitated to study a subject where there's a small take-up in the school by attending at another school, I would readily agree is not new and has happened for a long time and can be extremely valuable. Does Ms Gilruth agree, though, that a lot of the evidence we received was that in many schools that's not what would have happened? What would have happened was those 2 advanced higher pupils would be stuck at the back of a class of higher pupils or possibly even higher and national pupils and left to get on with it. And that's not acceptable.
Jenny Gilruth.
I thank you, Grace, for that intervention. I don't actually think that is reflective of all the evidence we heard. I think we heard contrary evidence to that, and we actually heard evidence from some who are teaching just now that advanced higher hub model works. I know it works in Glasgow, for example, with Caledonia, I think, University there. I know it works in Fife and Dunfermline, so I wouldn't accept that, Ingrid. I think I'll continue. So in terms of the pathways now, Presiding Officer, which are open for our pupils, it isn't just about school education anymore, it's about partnerships. In 2017-18, Fife had an impressive 7% of the national total of modern apprenticeship starts, with more than 27,000 taking up that qualification. And crucially, what those pathways to achievement are about is opening up equity in our education system. Presiding Officer, 5th and 6th year wasn't for everyone when I was at school. It should have been. But the system, and certainly my state school, strongly encouraged certain individuals to leave at the end of S4. If those individuals did choose to stay on, they were often prevented from studying a higher qualification, the gold standard of Scottish education. As the head of Aberdeenshire Education Advisory Committee, I was a head teacher in Maryhill for a number of years, and the school for which I was responsible for had fewer than 10% of the youngsters in S5 and S6 achieving 5 hires. When timetabling, we set a timetable that started with 5 different columns so that youngsters who were doing 5 hires could progress clearly through a column structure and then onwards from that. When doing that timetabling exercise, I always asked, what about the remaining 90% of children? So what about that 90%? What about equity? What about acknowledging that not all children achieve 5 hires in one sitting? What about poverty? Too often in education debates, we speak of school as an isolated institution immune from societal inequality. But Glenrothes High School in my constituency has benefited from additional £116,400 in the 2019-20 period through the People Equity Fund. That funding has been used to invest in a nurture base known as the Glen, which provides support for pupils with social and emotional issues. The benefits of this investment have been increased attendance, greater resilience and confidence. Many of those pupils just can't cope in class for extended periods of time. Many of them come to school hungry. In a town where nearly 1 in 3 children grow up in poverty, the staff in that school aren't in revolt about subject choice. Rather, they are dealing with the grim reality of 10 years of austerity in their cohort. Presiding Officer, I fear for the political debate around Scottish education. I fear that it's become overtly focused on academic badge collecting, as one head teacher described it to me. But what about those who take longer than 1 year to collect those badges? For far too long, many pupils were excluded from the Scottish education system. They were told they weren't clever enough to sit hires. They weren't clever enough to stay on at school. They were told that school was not for them. Presiding Officer, our school system, our education system should be about getting the best results for all pupils, and if they face disadvantage, then it should be the responsibility of the state to help them achieve it. So give them a nurture room, give them different pathways, allow them all to have the opportunity to succeed. That is what Curriculum for Excellence is about. Thank you.
Jenny Mara, followed by Rona Mackay.
I thank Presiding Officer, thank you. I thank Liz Smith for bringing this debate to the Chamber today. If education did not come under the powers of this Parliament and was still reserved to Westminster, I'm sure we would see tenfold the number of debates on education, with SNP motions telling us how much better it would be if the power rested in their hands. As it stands, the power is here, and since this Parliament was established in 1999, we have seen a decline in the standards of our education which many developed nations would simply not tolerate. Because, Presiding Officer, what other developed nation withdraws itself from international surveys on literacy, numeracy and science? These surveys that allow countries to draw wider conclusions about their own teaching practice and policies. I could not find one other country other than Scotland that has withdrawn from these surveys. Everyone knows that the wider the statistical survey, the more reliable the data and policy conclusions. What exactly leads our government to think that Scotland is better off out of these surveys? Scottish Labour's policy to re-enter these surveys as a matter of priority is one of the first of many things that should be done to reverse decline. Labour's amendment today focuses on the systematic use of multi-level teaching, and it has already been discussed in this debate. Last time we touched on this in the Chamber, in opposition time, I must add, John Swinney told me it was a good thing. But teachers and pupils don't agree. Ian Gray said it was a real problem in Dundee. Let me outline a bit of that for you. 42% of English classes are multi-level. English, the core of the most core subject you can take, 42%. 67% of physics classes are multi-level, 69% of biology classes, 58% of chemistry classes, and 65 and 64 of geography and history classes respectively are multi-level. This is from the analysis done in October by the Times newspaper. I think it's worthwhile, let me quote the Times piece more extensively. They said, Dundee, with high levels of poverty, is at the sharp end of the staffing crisis, with only 1 in 4 pupils getting 5 hires. Dwindling teacher numbers have left high schools operating at the bare bones, they have said. In total, teachers of 23 subjects, including biology, physics, modern languages and English, are forced to accommodate up to 3 lessons in one class, mostly for National 4, 5 and 6. One teacher who asked not to be named said that pupils taking NAT4, usually in S4 and at 14 to 15 years old, work alongside students preparing for their hires, who may be 17. Sometimes, they said, you're effectively teaching 2 classes at the same time. It's very challenging. They aren't always covering the same topics. This can mean teaching one group of children while the others read or work quietly and independently, then switching over, he said. Smaller schools with multi-level classes are at a disadvantage. Dundee, whose council is run by the SNP, has lost more than 200 teachers in the last decade, including 159 secondary school teachers. A large secondary school closed despite a slight increase in pupil numbers. The area has some of the lowest attainment rates in Scotland, with only 1 pupil in 10 from a deprived background achieving 5 hires. At one Dundee High School, 2/3 failed to pass a single hire last year. That was from the Times in October. But I would like, on multi-level teaching, for the Cabinet Secretary to reflect on this fact. Did he ever sit in a multi-level English class? I didn't. Because even at standard grade, classes were split clearly into credit, general and foundation classes, although you sat 2 papers. I would contend that multi-level English classes are unprecedented. I don't think today's pupils should have to do that either. Presiding Officer, let me hark back to my school days again, because I want to touch on this stuff about city campuses and advanced hire hubs that I think are really just dressed up phrases for sitting on a bus all day. Because in my day, it was called, advanced hires were called 6th-year studies, and these were always small classes. John Swinney looks at me disgruntled, but let me explain to him. People have always wanted to do this level to deepen their knowledge before university. I remember studying 6th-year history in a class of 5, and in biology I was the only candidate. Such were the options the school made available 25 years ago. If I were to take these advanced hires in Dundee today, I would not be allowed to study them in my own school. Schools across the city are prohibited by the council from offering advanced hire courses to classes of fewer than 10 pupils. Classes are pooled across the city in one location. So if you were to visit a secondary school in Dundee today, you will find pupils in the middle of the school day making their way, often on 2 buses, across the city to attend classes in a different school and making their way back again. If you've taken the bus to school in the morning and home again at night, as I used to, senior pupils are spending a huge amount of time of their day sitting on buses and travelling, rather than sitting, learning and studying. What kind of incentive is this to deepen your study, having to leave the warm school on a miserable and freezing January day and make your way halfway across the city? If Jenny Gilruth would like to intervene, I'd be more than happy to take an intervention.
I think, Ms. Matt.
Frankly, it is ridiculous, and it's simply a consequence of continual cuts from this government, and you can dress it up with any phrase you like. That is the practical consequence, and of course there is a knock-on for attainment. And I would invite any of the SNP to address this, because I think it undermines the whole comprehensive offering. Thank you.
Rona Mackay, followed by Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As a member of the Education Committee, I'm grateful to have the opportunity to speak positively about our schools' hard-working teachers and pupils. I'm also pleased that the Conservative Party welcomes the review of the senior phase of the Curriculum for Excellence. It's nice to hear them welcoming something. But of course, Liz Smith's motion quickly descends from the positive to the negative in predictable fashion. We know that pupil attainment levels are rising generally, with more young people going on to positive destinations, such as further education or apprenticeships, but still the opposition focus on the negative. Just for once, it would be good to hear them praise the achievements of our young people, instead of crying education is in crisis, failing schools, and more, not at the moment, I want to make some progress, and more hysterical outpourings, which must be really hard for teachers, parents and pupils to take. The senior phase head teacher survey was commissioned by the Scottish Government last summer. The 159 respondents were broadly representative of secondary schools in Scotland, including size of school, urban-rural location and proportion of pupils from the most deprived areas. The majority, 85% of head teachers, feel they're achieving an integrated, progressive and coherent experience for young people in the senior phase. 77% are confident that their school provides a sufficient variety of learning pathways to meet the needs of all the young people across the senior phase. Yes.
Daniel Johnson.
I thank Mona Mackay for giving me, but let me ask her two questions. First of all, does she not accept in order to make progress, we do need to acknowledge where there are issues that need to be addressed and weaknesses that need to be strengthened? And secondly, on the statistics she's quoting, does she not accept the Education Committee's survey response said 75% of school pupils said they did not have the choices they desired at school? Is that not the fundamental point in this debate?
Rona Mackay.
Well, on your first point, if I'm just going to go on to, of course, we need to constantly monitor and make improvements. And your second point about, sorry, can you remind me what your second point was? What was your second point in your question, please?
I can't give you any extra time.
Sorry.
Daniel Johnson.
That in the Education Committee's survey, that 75% of pupil respondents said they did not have the choices available to them that they wished to have.
Rona Mackay.
Yes, thank you, Presiding Officer. Yes, that was the case, but I mean it was also broadly discussed about the variation between local authorities and pupil choices, and very often it was the choice of the head teacher or the school that instigated that. 77% are confident the school provides a sufficient variety of learning pathways, and schools offered a wide range of courses and qualifications, including college provision, Duke of Edinburgh Award, foundation apprenticeships and Saltire Awards. And the majority of head teachers have established long-term partnerships with colleges and employers in order to develop their senior phase curriculum. The key element to all of this is flexibility being offered to senior pupils, such as individualised timetables to study the topics they're interested in. And we know that if young people are interested in a subject, they'll do well. The majority of schools offer pupils 6 or 7 courses in S4, 5 in S5 and 5 in S6, and have long-term partnerships with colleges and employers. In my constituency in Eastern Bartonshire, the latest Skills Development Scotland report shows that between 2016 and 2019, the gap in terms of those participating in education, training or work has decreased from 9.3% to 5.4%. Presiding Officer, last Friday, for the 4th year in a row, I attended a celebration of the Chinese New Year at St Ninian's High School in my constituency. As ever, it was an amazing performance from pupils with feeder primaries taking part. We even had a rendition of Loch Lomond in Mandarin and Scottish. And as ever, I thought how much learning had expanded since my school days. Now, I am aware that I'm fortunate to have high-achieving schools in my constituency, but their results fluctuate too, and that isn't a crisis. Ross Greer talked about deprived schools and deprived areas, but I believe it's down to some areas being hammered under the Tories' relentless austerity agenda. It's entirely socio-economic. Universal credit, food banks, living daily hand to mouth, these are the things that reduce attainment and foster inequality. No, thank you. Presiding Officer, it's down to the Scottish Government placing education at the top of our agenda to that a review of the curriculum for excellence in the senior phase is taking place. Of course, we're not saying everything's perfect, and we must constantly monitor and improve on areas where necessary that we can do. That is what responsible government does. A responsible government does not, like Boris Johnson's government, cut the Erasmus programme, which has helped millions of young people throughout the UK, broaden their education and life skills, and then reinstate it after an outcry. Before its reinstatement, the UK Education Secretary Gavin Williamson asked civil servants to consider plans for a replacement Erasmus programme, provided, quote, "it is in Britain's interest to do so." What planet is he on to even suggest that? What utter nonsense. It's in all our young people's interest to have the opportunity to take part in this wonderful scheme, and shame on the Tories for threatening it in the first place. Presiding Officer, the committee did conclude a lack of leadership from Scotland's public education bodies, such as Education Scotland and SQA, around the curriculum structure, which may have resulted in some cases in a narrowing of subject choices. And during evidence, we encountered a lack of awareness from these bodies, as others have said. I do think these organisations need to step up to the mark and embrace changes by integrating with schools and communities in order to fulfil their remit. Presiding Officer, during the general election campaign, one of the things we heard frequently while talking to people was that they're fed up with education and health being used as political footballs. I am too. Every system needs constant monitoring and improvement and constructive criticism, and debate is always welcome. but to use emotive language
Ms
and
Mackay,
distort
just
facts
closing.
does no one any good. So in conclusion, the Government continues to place education at the top of its agenda, but the opposition parties in here really must do better.
Need to tighten up on timings, please. Can I have Murdo Fraser followed by John Mason?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. At the start of this debate, my colleague Liz Smith set out the number of times we've debated education in this chamber in the past 5 years in government time, and we've also seen a great many debates in that time in opposition time, often highlighting what the opposition see as some of the weaknesses in the education system. And I would say to Rona Mackay, who raised this point, there are many good things in Scottish education. There's a lot of great work being done in our schools and many pupils performing well. But there are also weaknesses. And it's not unreasonable for the opposition in Parliament to point these out and highlight these to the government. In any political system, I think we would reasonably expect those who are in power at any given time to highlight those things that are generally going well and to dismiss the concerns of the opposition, while those in opposition will generally highlight the weaknesses. And if, as I sense it is, the government benches are frustrated that the opposition are using debates like this to highlight weaknesses in the education system, then the answer is in the government's own hands. They, after all, control the large majority of parliamentary time. There's nothing to stop the government scheduling more education debates to highlight what it sees as the positives. And we should also, in approaching these debates, dump the nonsense claim that we hear too often, that any criticism of what is happening in education is a criticism of hard-working staff or pupils. It is not. And I can say that with some authority because I am married to a teacher, and those members who know Mrs Fraser would know how brave an individual would have to be in my position to seek to blame teachers for the current ills of the education system. The teaching profession is as frustrated as many others are about some of the things happening in our schools, particularly issues with the curriculum, with subject choice and with shortages of teachers. Now, the focus for this afternoon's debate is the Curriculum for Excellence, a curriculum introduced with the best of intentions. In a world where future careers would depend upon flexibility, adaptability and the ability to problem solve, the Curriculum for Excellence was intended to develop the skills of individual pupils. In this, it represented a shift away from traditional Scottish education, where the focus was more on knowledge than skills. It was no longer so important for young people to know things, but more important for them to be able to work things out. And that was a laudable objective. But there is increasing concern that the shift from knowledge to skills has gone too far, and it has left too many pupils without a basic grounding in the knowledge they will need for their future lives and careers. And this concern is recognised even amongst those who were fundamental in the development of Curriculum for Excellence. Yes, of course.
John Swinney.
I wonder if Mr Fraser would acknowledge that, or I wonder what his view is, as to whether the question of the acquisition of knowledge or the acquisition of skills is an either-or question or it's a both question.
Murdo Fraser.
I think that's a reasonable question for the Cabinet Secretary to pose. I think the point I was trying to make was this is all about the balance between the two. So it's not about either-or, it's about finding the right balance. I'd like to quote to the Cabinet Secretary what Keir Bloomer, one of the architects of Curriculum for Excellence, said in April last year. And he said this: one of the purposes of CFE was to broaden pupils' education, but instead the way it is being implemented is narrowing it significantly. And Keir Bloomer has also criticised the complexity of the curriculum and the mountain of guidance that has been accumulated, an issue I know that the Cabinet Secretary has been endeavouring to address. Another educationalist, Professor Lindsay Patterson from Edinburgh University, put it very clearly when he wrote last April, Scottish educational policy, although not the Scottish tradition, is behind the times on this. Advanced thinking about the curriculum in many countries accepts that knowledge comes first. Breadth of knowledge stimulates the skill people will need to cope with an unpredictable world. Narrowing the curriculum is a tragedy because it closes the minds of young Scots. That is not the way to build an outward-looking nation. So it's education experts like these we need to be listening to. And they have also, of course, raised concerns around the question of the restriction of subject choice, which we've already heard debated in the Chamber this afternoon. Most worrying of all, that restriction of subject choice impacts most on those pupils from the most deprived backgrounds, while those from better off backgrounds do not face the same limitations, a point made earlier in the debate by Ross Greer. According to research conducted last year by Reform Scotland, schools cutting the number of exams on offer are typically those serving our more deprived communities, further limiting the life opportunities of children who may already be disadvantaged. If the Scottish Government is serious about closing the attainment gap, this is a matter it needs to address. This Parliament's Education Committee, in their report in September, unanimously expressed concern about the disconnect between education and the SQA, about responsibility for the structure and design of new qualifications in Scotland, which has unintended consequences for the implementation of curriculum for excellence in the senior phase. When the committee of this Parliament concludes that unanimously on a cross-party basis, then that is something the government needs to be paying attention to. So what now needs to happen, Presiding Officer? As Liz Smith set out at the start of this debate, a review of the senior phase is welcome, but does not go far enough. There needs to be a wider look at broad general education and its articulation with the senior phase. Because if we can't get the first 3 years in secondary right, we are not laying the foundations for S4 to S6. And finally, Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government have to recognise that there are issues here that have to be addressed. I was very concerned to see reported in the papers today the comments from an SNP MP, Carol Monaghan, on the PISA report, who described it as, I quote, crude and corrupt. That level of denial on the part of a member of the party of government here does the government no service whatsoever, and I hope the Cabinet Secretary would distance himself from these remarks. It's not just good enough to say Scottish education is doing better. It is doing better in some areas, but it needs to be better than it is, and the starting point is understanding what needs to be improved. I have pleasure in supporting the amendment in Liz Smith's name.
John Mason, followed by Daniel Johnson.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, for the opportunity to speak. As members will know, I've not been on the Education and Skills Committee, but I've been interested to read the report, Subject Choices in Schools. So firstly, if I can make a few comments on the report itself. The committee itself states that the crux of their inquiry was in the number of subject choices available at S4. And I think we all accept that this is one angle on curriculum for excellence. But it is only one angle, and I wonder if there's a risk that we focus too much on this, which is, after all, an input, as against being focused on outputs and outcomes. It does seem at times that the Conservatives want to return to the so-called golden days with a more traditional curriculum structure and young people sitting 7 or 8 exams in S4. And I do accept that fewer qualifications are being achieved now. But it seems to me that the more important question is how the end outcome for young people is changing. Are young people coming out of the senior phase with more or fewer opportunities? The Association of Directors of Education in Scotland produced a report in November entitled Excellence and Equity, Raising Attainment, Improving Life Chances in Scotland's Schools. Amongst other points it states that attainment continues to be linked to deprivation, but attainment of school leavers in the 20% most deprived postcodes is improving at a faster rate than in the least deprived 20%. It also looks at positive destinations for school leavers, that is, HE, FE, employment, training or activity agreement. From 2009-10 to 17-18, there was an overall improvement in achieving positive destinations from 87% to 94.4%. Whereas in 9-10 there was a 14.7% gap between those entering positive destinations from the 20% most and least deprived areas, by 17-18 that gap had reduced to only 6.8%. So it seems to me that we have some very positive figures there for outcomes from the senior phase. Going back to the committee report itself, Education Scotland is quoted as saying, "The right time to review the overall achievements of young people is at the point of exit from the senior phase, rather than any individual year." SQA also makes the point that whereas some children benefited a lot from the old system, not all did. There is now a wider range of options. Absolutely.
I thank the member for giving way. Does he not recognise it's a problem when young people themselves complain about the fact that they don't have access to all the subjects that they would have had in the past, and they're concerned about it?
That was Oliver Mundell for the official report. John
Sorry. Thank you. Well, first of all, I think back to my own experience at school. When we had to choose between history or geography, we could not do both. There was no modern studies, there was no biology, there was no finance or accountancy, and we only got a modern language because my father went up to the school and argued for it. So I'm not sure that choices were better in the past. We now have more options with colleges now, which I don't think used to be so much the case. So there are different options. And another point, which I'm trying to come on to later if I have time on that, is that it's all very well what young people are wanting, and I think we should absolutely respect that. At the same time, we want more people into STEM, we want more women into traditional male employment. So there has to be a bit of guidance for young people as well as listening to what they want. The Cabinet Secretary made the point to the committee there is inevitability of subject choice in any education system, and neither he nor any council or school can guarantee unfettered choice for every pupil in the country. Again, the Conservatives have to be a bit more realistic in all this. They are the party that wants lower taxes. And if that happened, there would be less money for schools, there would be fewer teachers, there would be larger class sizes, and there would be a further reduction in subject choice. Okay.
Murdo Fraser.
Grateful to Mr Mason for giving way. I wonder if he's aware of the fact that spending per head on education in England is substantially lower than it is in Scotland. We benefit, of course, from the Barnett formula and the union dividend. But does it not therefore recognise that it cannot entirely be about resources, because educational outcomes in England are in many cases ahead of Scotland despite lower spending?
John Mason.
I think that depends how you measure the outcomes. I mean, I go into schools fairly frequently. I see young people who are a lot more confident, able, and in a whole range of skills that I did not have when I was at school. I would not. They can stand up and do public speaking, which I would not have done at their age. So I think we have to be very careful how we measure outcomes and not just focus on the things we can measure, which I accept is a problem with my accountancy profession at times. To move on quickly, on the question of how much freedom individual schools should have, the report says the committee recognises there's an inherent tension between providing schools with the freedom to set their own structure and expecting our young people to have a consistent experience and opportunities. I was asking Glasgow City Council about this, and they say they do not prescribe to schools what they should do in S4 to 6. Schools are asked to design a curriculum which is broad and balanced and enables them to achieve positive outcomes. Almost all now stay on in school beyond S4, and there are a variety of models, particularly in partnership with colleges, which I accept may be easier in a city context. I'm going to have to miss out a few things I was going to say, but I did want to give one example between the balance between academic and vocational. Sometimes maybe we're saying that some schools have too much emphasis on the vocational, maybe some schools have too much emphasis on the academic. One of my younger relations was being pushed by his parents to go to university, but he felt it was not for him. He resisted. He's now working in the renewable sector with wind turbines and seems to be doing extremely well. Thank you.
And thank you for keeping to time, Mr Mason. There is very little time, so all members will have to keep to their limit if they take an intervention, try and do so within their own time frame. Daniel Johnson.
I'm going to begin, Presiding Officer, by being the classroom sook and wishing you a very happy birthday. Maybe I'll get some extra time for that. I think this has been an important debate, and it's been a reflective debate. And I think while this debate has been prompted by the report by the Education Committee on subject choice, actually a much more fundamental question has been broached through this, and in particular by Liz Smith at the very beginning, which is the tenor and context within which we want to discuss education in Scotland. And can I gently say to some of the members of the government backbenches that it's simply not credible to bemoan the opposition's approach and then not reflect on any of the weaknesses that need to be addressed in Scottish education, because we could have the best functioning education system in the world and there would still be issues that we would need to address. But more importantly, should be no surprise that we want to discuss education for two important reasons. First of all, education is of fundamental importance to this country, both for our particular children, but on our future as a country as a whole. But also because Curriculum for Excellence has been a bold and radical change. And when you embark on bold and radical change, you need to reflect and review how that has gone. And that requires frankness, and it requires issues to be identified. So Liz Smith is right. We should celebrate the fact that more people are staying on till the end of sixth year. We should celebrate the fact that, just in a moment, Mr Sweeney, we should celebrate the fact that more people are achieving one higher. But we must also acknowledge the fact that higher pass rates are declining and the number of hires being passed in S4 is falling. And it's only when we acknowledge issues like that we can make progress in our schools and in our education system. And I'll take the intervention from Mr Swinney.
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm grateful to Mr Johnson. In the spirit that Mr Johnson is expressing his views, would he accept that the Government's decision to commission the OECD to review the CFE and the Broad General Education in 2015 was an indication of honestly facing up to some of those challenges and then honestly facing up to implementing the issues, the challenging issues that they raised with us about what action we had to take to remedy the issues they found?
Daniel Johnson.
I think that review is positive, but it did take the report from the Education Committee, and since we have that report has been commissioned, we've also had an attempt to stonewall those very statistics around higher passes and the number of hires. So while I do acknowledge that it's positive, and I actually also acknowledge the positive tenor in which the Cabinet Secretary made his opening remarks, we do need to go much further. We do need much more frankness in terms of the approach from the government. But in terms of the issue at the heart of this debate, one of breadth, there are also, I think, a number of areas where we need that candour again. And indeed, the issues have been laid bare in the report, and I think also examined in some depth already. But let me try and bring my own reflections to them. In essence, I think that we have had something of a collision of the aims and ambitions of Curriculum for Excellence in terms of providing the maximum number of choices and the practicalities of delivering those range of choices. That starts with the qualification design themselves, the issue of 160 hours, the fact that while it was intended to have 2-year blocks, the reality is that most schools deal with 1 year at a time with the expectation that pupils will sit a tranche of exams year by year through the senior phase. There's also been a lack of clarity around how the senior phase should be implemented. While Mr Swinney has rightly questioned about whether we should be prescriptive or leave those decisions up to schools and down to local decision making, the reality is for most schools it's not up to them. It is mandatory that they deliver 6. And indeed, sometimes that mandatory requirement isn't even consistent within a local authority. I have personal experience where some schools in a local authority area have been mandated to teach 6, whereas other schools have been allowed to continue with 8 subjects in S4. But ultimately, the issue with breadth is one in terms of the division between theory and practice. And Mr Swinney, in some senses, is correct. There are more potential pathways open to people, young people in our schools today than there were in the past. But that is at a system level. I think the key question is whether all of those pathways are open to every pupil in every school. And the reality is the conclusion of the Education Committee report is clear. And I quote from the report, "It is evident there has been a reduction in the number of subjects available to pupils in S4. The reality is the list of subjects available to pupils in front of them when they're making those choices in S3 is shorter than it used to be. But it also, I think, questionable whether even in theory it is correct. Because while there may be more choices available in S4, are there the same number of choices available in S5 and going into S6? The reality is breadth is more than just how many options someone might have in S4. To me, it's about how many options does that young person have when they leave school. And the key question, I think, for the OECD is whether or not that has improved or has got worse. I have a very short amount of time remaining to, but I think the other key issue found in the report was the issues around multi-level teaching. And I would just echo the reflections of my colleague Ian Gray, because quite simply, it is untenable to try and teach 3 subject levels within a certain class, and especially within particular areas. So, in conclusion, Presiding Officer, I think there are key structural issues, both in terms of the senior phase itself, but also in terms of the broader system that the government has put in place around our education systems, questions around the institutions such as Education Scotland. But overall, what we really need, what the real change we need, is a different approach, a more reflective approach, a more open approach from this government if we're going to make progress in Scottish education. Thank you.
Thank you. And it's Joan McAlpine next, to be followed by Jamie Green. Joan McAlpine.
Thank you very much. I welcome the review of the senior phase. It seems to me that it's a very appropriate response to the Education Committee's report. As has been said by Claire Adamson, it was a unanimous and considered report, and I would urge opposition parties to pay heed to the comments by the convener of the Education Committee when she said that the Education Committee inquiry did not conclude that young people were being damaged. That is what the review was set up to investigate, and I believe that we need to give it time and space to do its job. I note that, as well as the convener of the Education Committee, there are other respected voices welcoming the senior phase review, including the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and I'd like to take the opportunity to thank the RSE for their briefing for today's debate. Their document states that the RSE supports the Scottish Government's commitment to commission an independent review of the senior phase of Curriculum for Excellence. The senior phase review, it says, should seek to develop a forward-looking shared vision for Scottish education and provide a practical focus for how it is to be achieved. In this way, it should take account of the existing evidence base, including the committee report into subject choice and the OECD report on improving schools. But it must be focused on the future in doing so. I note that the RSC seek assurances on the review's independence, particularly as it already includes, as it should, organisations such as Education Scotland and the local authorities who are deeply embedded in the delivery of Curriculum for Excellence. The RSC also suggests that consideration should be given to the relationship between the Senior Phase Review and the University of Stirling's two-year Nuffield-funded research into the impact of different secondary school phase pathways on educational outcomes. The Society agreed that the government agreed with the government that the review should not be focused on national qualifications, rather it should be geared towards generating a shared agenda for the senior phase. I support the RSC advice to focus on the future. We should not be afraid to adapt and change, but at the same time, we must not throw away what we have been doing well. And in Scottish education, as people have acknowledged across the chamber today, we are already doing many things very well. One of those areas is in vocational provision, which for young people in the senior phase is growing. The number of school leavers attaining vocational qualifications at level 5 and above has increased from 7.3% in 2013-14 to 14.8% in 2017-18. Over 54,000 skills-based qualifications, awards and certificates have been achieved last year, 2019, more than double the figure attained in 2012. That is something that has changed remarkably, and it's also something that people I speak to as an MSP, pupils and teachers and parents alike, tell me that's what they want for their children. They want alternative pathways for their children that aren't necessarily traditionally academic ones. The growth of foundation apprenticeships, the collaboration between schools, colleges and employers in developing the young workforce is a great testament to the progress that we have made in delivering a modern, outcomes-focused educational offering. The reality is that our young people are achieving a breadth of awards, giving them the best chance of success in further learning, life and work. A survey in June last year asked secondary head teachers for their perspectives on implementing the senior phase curriculum. Of those who responded, 97% of head teachers accommodated requests for more or fewer course choices by offering flexibility. The majority of schools offer pupils 6 or 7 courses in S4, S5 and 5 in S6 and have long-term partnerships with colleges and employers. Over half of head teachers started planning for the senior phase when young people were in S2, and 90% felt that they were able to ensure continuity of learning. Almost 9 out of 10 head teachers said that they had autonomy to determine the senior phase in their school. So the action that the SNP Scottish Government is taking in terms of vocational education, in terms of offering head teachers and teachers more flexibility, is certainly making progress. And another area that we're making progress on is teacher recruitment. Teacher numbers increased for the 3rd year in a row, rising from 52,247 in 2019. Scotland has more teachers per pupil than elsewhere in Britain. According to the latest school census figures, in Scotland there are 7,485 teachers for every 100,000 pupils. In England there are 5,545 teachers for every 100,000 pupils. And in Wales, there are 5,038 teachers for every 100,000 pupils. So Scotland is delivering way ahead of the rest of the UK nations. There are many good things happening in Scottish education. And yes, there are areas where concerns have been raised around the curriculum for excellence and how it has been implemented in the senior phase. That is not for this debate. That is for the independent review, and that we should wait and see what those experts conclude. And I very much look forward to hearing that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I call Jamie Green to be followed by Bob Doris.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's been quite heartening listening to this debate, because right across the chamber I think there's been an interesting discussion and a genuine debate about education in Scotland from the majority of speeches that I've heard. Not all, I'm sure. But I think we often forget at the heart of this are three distinct and very important groups of people whose voices need to be heard in this debate. That's those of teachers, of pupils themselves, and of parents. And let me start with teachers. About 18 months ago, the First Minister told teachers that her door is always open to them, and encouraged teachers right across Scotland to write to her about their concerns and experiences in Scottish education. FOI requests revealed that the First Minister received over 100 submissions from teachers describing a wide range of issues, from the incredibly long hours that they work through to some of the abuse that they face in our classrooms. Now, I'm not a parent, but thankfully I've had the benefit of dealing with numerous local cases of stressed teachers who are off work, often whistleblowers, telling me what is really going on in their places of work, and complaining to me that they are either too afraid to complain or feel like no one is listening to them when they do. Now, I'm confident that right across this chamber, people will join me in saying that nobody, absolutely nobody, deserves to face physical or verbal abuse in their place of work. But it is true that the number of assaults on teachers rose by 10% last year. That is a statistic in this debate that should worry us all. I mention it because at this point, that is where that first group interacts with the other two. The theory that we talk about education in this chamber is quickly matched by the reality that is faced in schools. We could not have a debate like that of today if we fail to acknowledge, quite simply, that many classrooms are simply too full, that many teachers are teaching multiple levels in those classes, many schools are oversubscribed, many schools have teacher shortages, and many young people quite simply cannot choose the subjects that they want to study. This isn't about talking anything down. This is a simple reality check. And that takes me to the third group, and that's the pupils themselves. Now, regardless of who said what over recess about the SQA results that have been rehearsed today, behind closed doors or otherwise, ministers must clearly concede that things are not entirely well. Therefore, have asked and instructed civil servants to investigate. It is a fact that pass rates at higher and advanced higher fell to their lowest levels since the Curriculum for Excellence was introduced 5 years ago. It's also a fact that these were held as a strong set of results. It is a fact that reduced subject choice clearly reduces the destinations and options open to young people. So whatever your ideological views on the Curriculum for Excellence, its complexities or otherwise, alarm bells surely must be ringing. So any investigation announced today is welcome, but I would say from the outset that the full results and the full findings of that report should be published in their entirety when they are available. Because Liz Smith was right when she said, what we want to know is why these rates are falling. What is the root cause of it? How do we get underneath it? And more importantly, what will the government do about it? And my problem, Presiding Officer, is that I'm nervous that ministers will not only fail to acknowledge those findings, but if their failures are identified, they will fail to accept responsibility for them. Because there already is a precedent in here of questioning those who question them, as we've heard from some of the ridiculous statements made in the centre benches today. But behind the bluff and the bluster, I do believe that the Deputy First Minister cares deeply about the outcomes of Scottish young people. I believe that he does understand that we are experiencing problems with the CFE. And I think he does worry that unless action is taken, there is the real risk that the defining legacy of this administration will be a decline in Scottish education. And if he is not worried about such a legacy, he should be. I close with the third group that I want to talk about, and that's parents themselves. Much has been said today about multi-level teaching, and that jumps out at me as an issue that does worry parents. It's difficult enough for teachers to teach students in 1 year who have multiple levels of abilities themselves, never mind 2, 3, or even 4 years of levels. How can that be acceptable to parents? We heard in Dundee the example where multi-level classes accounted for 60% of secondary teaching. In North Lanarkshire, all schools are using some form of multi-level teaching. Other schools are making extensive use of this practice. Argyll and Bute, East Renfrewshire, Aberdeen, Inverclyde in my region. But it's a postcode lottery. How is that acceptable? The fact that numerous independent and respected bodies have critiqued this policy says a lot. Why? Because it simply cannot be argued that this is improving outcomes. It cannot be acceptable to parents, to teachers, or to pupils. Presiding Officer, the whole point of the senior phase of Curriculum for Excellence surely is to equip our young people with the skills, the knowledge and the experience they need to offer them the widest possible opportunities after they leave school. It's as simple as that, be it academic, further or higher, or non-academic. So I will end as I started. Listen. Please listen to those to whom this matters, to pupils, to teachers, and to parents. And if you won't listen to us, Deputy First Minister, please listen to them.
Thank you. I call Bob Doris before we move to closing speeches. Bob Doris.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, when I was first elected as a regional MSP at the time for Glasgow in 2007, Curriculum for Excellence and the emerging new national qualifications framework was a significant focus of both government and Parliament back then. Indeed, in the months and years which followed, a number of Labour MSPs, some of whom had served in the previous Scottish Executive, urged us in government to get on with those reforms. They were right, of course, they were the right thing to do, and they had said, certainly privately and sometimes publicly, that there had already been far too much delay, and I name-check Cathy Jamieson, as Ian Gray did earlier on in the debate. The underlying principles are strong, and there are many good examples of exemplary practice, and I do want to name-check very briefly the schools in my constituency who offer a variety of choices. John Paul Academy, Springburn Academy, St Roch's and Clevedon all do exceptional jobs, and of course there are always constraints, but they do exceptional jobs. But it is of course right to review the implementation of Curriculum for Excellence, particularly in the senior school phase from S4 to S6. My thanks to the Education Committee for their work on this matter, and I commend the Scottish Government for announcing to that review of the senior phase. Can I say, even if there wasn't a compelling Education Committee report, this would still be the right thing to do. It's time to see how things are getting on out there. I've listened carefully to the debate today, and there does seem to be a tension between prescribing subject provision in the senior school, whether at a local authority or a government level, and when flexibility can be shown by schools and head teachers. We have to be very honest about that tension between local flexibility or postcode lottery. They can be the same thing depending on how you look at it. And on that note, I would see that the head teacher survey found that 97% of head teachers accommodated requests for either more or fewer subjects or course choices when that was requested. And I also note in that same survey that over half of head teachers start planning for the senior school stage as early as S2. Of course they should, but let me make some observations about those statistics. Firstly, I'd be keen to compare a head teacher survey, as valuable as that is, on the senior phase subject choices with that of departmental heads also. Indeed, timetabling provision in the S1 to S3 years can drive student footfall for choices made in senior school. We have to better understand that connectivity, and departmental heads will have a meaningful insight into that. Indeed, when I taught modern studies many years ago, it's difficult to get your kid to take modern studies in S3 when you see them for six classes twice a year, and they have 12 classes of modern studies, whereas maybe they've had 2 entire years of geography. So the decisions you make on timetabling S1 to S3 quite often dictates and drives subject provision in the senior school, and we have to better understand that connectivity. I'd also like to say that far more than half of head teachers, it's not actually that good that more than half of head teachers are planning from S2, because far more should be planning for senior school provision from S2 onwards, and they should be better understanding that connectivity. So we do have to do better. But there is a health warning with any potential senior phase changes that may come in, because there's a long lead-in time to how you change senior school subject provision in terms of having the right numbers of teachers, the right skill set and subject choices available. It takes time, and teachers will want to see change, I am sure, but they'll want that change to be considered and planned. They will want incremental change rather than a big bang approach to it. So let's look carefully at what this senior school review shows. And there are some understandable educational outcomes in Scottish schools which are actually outstanding. And I've got a whole, as you'd expect, your government backbenches, you're given a list of statistics that are good about educational outcomes. I'm not going to rehearse those. They exist, and I think today we've all acknowledged that those exist. But of course, we can always, no matter who's in power, we can always do better. That's a self-evident fact. So I do want to make some asks for the senior phase review that the government's taking place, and I think that's where the debate should be right now, in my opinion. And some of those do relate to multi-level teaching. So I've taught standard grade. It was bog standard, quite frankly, because of low school roles in some of the secondary schools I taught in over the years, that I taught foundation and general and credit all in one class, and they all had an exit exam, which was important as well. If I get a little bit of time back, Mr Gray.
Not very much.
Okay.
Ian Gray.
I just want to say, well, Mr Doris, to acknowledge that standard grades were designed to be taught in the way he's just described.
Bob Doris.
You want to make that very point, Mr Gray. So the key thing, of course, is that the syllabus and the content mirrored each other. So foundation and general and credit were looking at the same content at that time. Similarly with Access 3, Intermediate 1 and Intermediate 2 as well. And multi-level teaching in itself is not a bad thing, but of course we have to look at the National Qualifications Framework, and we have to look at the syllabus of various subjects to make sure they articulate and they mirror that multi-level teaching to support it. So I'm not against multi-level teaching, but we have to get the content right to support teachers in challenging circumstances. I also want to ask the government to look again about national Nat 5 provision, because some kids will want to do Nat 5 and S4 rather than a 2-year higher. They may be borderline whether they'll secure the higher, and if there's not a mirroring or articulation of the syllabus after 2 years, if they don't get the higher, they might not get their Nat 5. That's something we have to look at as well. And finally, presiding officer, in relation to the range of hires that young people can do, there has always been limitations on them, but we have to better understand. We'll have to better understand if young people are seeking to go into higher education, the types of hires they do at a first sitting might dictate whether they get into their university courses of choice. So we have to better understand that. It's not an appeal to say every kid can do everything all the time, because they can't, and any party that pretends they can are just wrong. But let's maximise those opportunities, and the government reviews the way to do that. But a lot of good work in schools, and actually in this Parliament, quite a lot of consensus, presiding officer.
Thank you very much, Mr Doris. And we'll move now to winding up speeches. Mary Fee on behalf of the Labour Party.
Thank you, presiding officer. On education, the First Minister once said, "I'm putting my neck on the line. I am asking to be judged on it." And 5 years on, the First Minister and her party do all they can to backtrack on that commitment. Education appears to be low on the SNP priority list, meaning that children, parents and teachers continue to be let down. And speaker after speaker today expressed concerns and frustrations over the problems in our education system. And Liz Smith opened the debate today by covering in detail the many concerns and highlighted the lack of response from this government, both in committee and in this chamber, to the many questions that have been asked. Ian Gray spoke at length about the narrowing of the curriculum and the problems that it causes. Ross Greer rightly spoke of lack of leadership. An opposition speaker after opposition speaker raised the very justifiable concerns that we have. And that was, presiding officer, in stark contrast to government speakers who minimised or dismissed the problems. And, Presiding Officer, I want to thank the Conservatives for once again using their debate time to allow us to debate education, something that the Government has not done for a number of years. And a report card on the SNP's handling of our education system would show Fs on every measure, from attainment, class sizes, investment, teacher numbers and subject choices. And it is very clear that the crisis in Scottish schools and the problems in colleges and universities is one of the Scottish Government's own making. And that is why it's disgraceful that the only way to bring the Government to the Chamber to answer on their record is for opposition parties to drag them here by using their allocated debating time. The Scottish Government's spin machine will try to hoodwink us and the public that education in their hands is in great shape. Pupils, parents and teachers know otherwise. And, Presiding Officer, the Education and Skills Committee inquiry into subject choices in schools, as highlighted in the motion, confirms that education in SNP hands is letting our children and our young people down. The committee rightly expressed concerns over the extensive increase in the use of multi-level teaching. And we agree and believe that this is systematic, and that is why we have lodged an amendment today. Multi-level teaching leaves pupils at a disadvantage and should not be driven by the lack of resources in our schools. Any review of education should cover the use of multi-level teaching and address why it is happening and how widespread the issue is. Very briefly.
Jenny Gilruth.
Thank Mary Fee for giving way. In evidence to the committee, Jerry Lyons from the Association of Directors of Education advised us that we try to create courses that articulate well so that when necessary, bi-level teaching can take place without any disadvantage to the young people. Does Mary Fee not trust Scotland's teachers to differentiate their lessons as they always have done?
Mary Fee.
What I would say to the member is not the teachers. And we can talk about the theory of how the senior phase works, but the practice in schools is something completely different. And the Government have to acknowledge that. As the committee did note, there is a lack of data on the use of multi-level teaching. And to fully assess why this is, questions should rightly be asked of Education Scotland on its handling and knowledge of multi-level teaching. The S4 and senior phase is a crucial part of a child's education. It is these formative years that shape a young adult's future. It is positive that the number of pupils leaving after their fourth year is decreasing. However, my concern is that schools are then unable to offer a wider range of subjects in S5 and S6, leading us to question the use of multi-level teaching and the implementation of the curriculum for excellence. And care-experienced young people are more likely to leave at the end of S4, and more can and must be done to ensure that they have the opportunity to thrive in S5 and S6 and then move into higher or further education, if that's the path they wish to choose. However, I do concede that this ambition cannot be down to schools alone. It requires a multi-agency approach, and I will support the Scottish Government and local authorities in their efforts to support care-experienced young people achieve better opportunities. And, Presiding Officer, attainment levels remain a growing concern for Scottish Labour. The figures released at the end of 2019 revealed that the attainment gap in literacy and numeracy increases throughout the stages of primary school, despite a slight narrowing of the overall attainment gap. In secondary schools, the attainment rates for hires has fallen over 4 years in a row. An unwanted trend, regardless of what spin John Spinney attempts to cover the facts with. And of course, statistics tell us that more pupils are leaving school to go on to positive destinations. However, when those positive destinations include 0 hours employment, this is something to be treated with caution. And on subject choices, pupils are missing out on opportunities to expand their education, and a majority of parents, 73%, as the Education and Skills Committee found, stated that their child was unable to take all of the subjects that they wanted. Children in private schools are being offered more subjects, resulting in a systematic inequality for young people. And finally, Presiding Officer, can I repeat my appreciation to the Tories for bringing today's debate? And I do hope that the Scottish Government will listen carefully, not just to opposition parties, but to pupils, parents and teachers, and bring forward a full review of Scottish education that will open up opportunities to future pupils that pupils in schools are missing out on now. Thank you.
Thank you. And I call on the Cabinet Secretary, John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, I don't in any way want to do anything more than I've already done to damage the political career of Daniel Johnson, but I do think his contribution to the debate today was reflective of a very good tenor of the debate, and for my part, I hope members of Parliament feel I've engaged in the spirit of that today, and I very much welcome the contribution that Jamie Green made in that respect, because I take deadly seriously the issues around performance in the Scottish education system, which is what, I will give way to Mr Finlay, because I didn't earlier on, but I will do so in a moment, because I take deadly seriously these issues. Now, Daniel Johnson made the point that when we undertake bold and radical change in an education system, we have to be prepared for independent validation, and we have exposed ourselves to that once already with the Curriculum for Excellence review on the broad general education, which reported in 2015, and we're doing it again with the senior phase review. And I hope that satisfies Parliament about the willingness of the Government to address these issues, because there are many findings from the 2015 review that I've been concentrating on implementing about reducing bureaucracy, slimming down guidance, clarifying the standards that are expected at different stages in the education system so that teachers are clear about what is expected of them. That is part of me recognising the challenges that there are within Scottish education, of which I am perfectly open to state very clearly, and the need to take action to address those issues. I'll give way to Mr Finlay.
Neil Findlay. Can I thank Mr Swinney? Will he make it absolutely clear that he will play no part in condemning MSPs who bring forward very serious concerns about Scottish education, where we are dismissed as talking Scotland down? This is the most serious issue affecting young people in the country, and we cannot have that. That's the role of the opposition, is to hold the government to account. And on that point, can I ask him, what is the government also doing about the start of education, where we're seeing 26% of young people in P1 to P3 in classes of over 26, and only yesterday I met a class in here with their teacher that was over 31 pupils.
Cabinet Secretary.
We've reduced the number of P1 pupils that are in classes in excess of 26 pupils to a level where there are now only 10 equivalent classes in the whole of Scottish education, and we reduced that. I don't have the number we reduced it from, but we've reduced it very significantly to only 10 classes. And on Mr Finlay's substantive point, I'm all for an open debate about performance. Actually, I'm coming on to this debate about performance because, yes, there are challenges in Scottish education. I've just made that I've just put that. I'm not ducking that at all. But there's also good performance. And this is where I part company with Jenny Mara in her contribution, because Jenny Mara said that we'd presided over a 10-year decline in performance in Scottish education. And I'll just go through what's happened. Of those achieving a level 5 qualification, such as a National 5, the percentage has increased from 71% when we came to office to almost 86% now. The number getting a level 6 qualification, such as a higher, has increased from less than a half when we came to office to almost 2/3. If Mr Johnson will forgive me, for the first time ever, more than 30% of pupils are achieving at least 5 higher passes, up from just 20% in 2009. And young people achieving skills-based qualifications has increased from 47,747 to over 64,000 in 2019. So that is the progress that has been delivered. And yes, let's face up to the challenges, but let's have an honest debate about performance. Now, in the course of the debate, a number of contributions have been made. John Mason made the point that what he sees coming out of our schools are young people who are much more confident, much more engaged in our society. Claire Adamson talked about the visit that we'd had to Braidhurst High School just last week, where we saw the contribution of young people able to fulfil their potential by the flexibility offered through Curriculum for Excellence to enable young people to be able to pursue, yes, their dream of becoming a professional footballer, but also to be able to secure the necessary education that will enable them to prosper in life when their football career perhaps doesn't it doesn't progress them for as long as they would generally like it to do so. So there are many attributes about Curriculum for Excellence that meet the needs of learners. And listening to the voices and the views of learners, as I did this morning at Musselburgh Grammar School, when I listened carefully to the points of view from pupils at the school, that should shape our thinking as we take forward these issues. Now, the Conservative amendment talks about a review of the broad general education. We'll see what Parliament votes for tonight, but I have placed on the record some of the dangers why a review of the broad general education at this stage in implementing the last review of the broad general education, I don't think is the necessary priority. But I do want to highlight what I think are some of the points of debate and dispute in this debate this afternoon. Some of the debate, there's 4 issues I want to cover. The first is about whether we should make a judgment about what young people achieve at the point of exit, or whether we should focus on the content of what they do in S4. That is a point of genuine dispute. Secondly, there's a debate between prescription and flexibility. And Bob Doris is absolutely correct. One person's flexibility is another person's postcode lottery, and we should be alive to that. I'm on the side of flexibility. I get the same. Mr Greer was not on the side necessarily in principle of more prescription, but recognise there's a debate to be had there. There is a debate about knowledge versus, I'm afraid I'll have, Mr Johnson will have to forgive me tonight, debate between knowledge versus skills, although I would point out that in the fresh curriculum narrative, which was published last year, we said Scotland's curriculum helps our children and young people gain the knowledge, skills and attributes needed for life in the 21st century. And I stand by that statement. They need the knowledge, skills and attributes. The question is whether they are all in the right balance, which was the issue I was trying to address. And lastly, is there sufficient breadth in the curriculum? I believe that a broad general education entitlement for young people up to the end of S3 is a longer, broader general education than I got when I was at school, and we have to make sure, and that's what the benchmarks are designed to do, that young people are getting that entitlement to a broad general education that then articulates into the senior phase. So these are some of the issues which I don't think we need a review of the broad general education to consider these further. I'm very happy to discuss them with members of Parliament and with the Education Committee as we take forward the review of the senior phase and make sure that Scotland's curriculum delivers what we have said it should deliver for every single young person in Scotland, that we should help our young people gain the knowledge, skills and attributes needed for life in the 21st century. That is our promise, and that is what we must deliver.
Thank you very much. And I call on Oliver Mundell to conclude our debate.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It may be a new year and you may be another year older, but we've certainly not seen anything new from the Deputy First Minister. It's another example of wheeling out the rhetoric and not explaining the lack of delivery. It's just the same old trio of delay, dither and denial, and you only have to look at the Government's amendment tonight to see that. Listening to today's debate, it seems almost impossible to remember, but I do remember when teachers were excited that John Swinney was taking over the education portfolio, that this SNP government's most competent and able performer had been put in charge of their national priority, that the days of pretending that everything was well with education reforms were over, that there would be bold and decisive action, that no barriers would be put in the way of delivering the world-leading education that Scotland had such a proud history of. But the reality, as we enter 2020, is that these same teachers now see the Cabinet Secretary as being part of the problem rather than the solution. Over the past year in particular, he has come to personify the SNP government's central issue when it comes to education policy, and that is to come into this chamber and proclaim confidently that everything is fine, that we're on track, that we've got all the information that we need, and just hope that no one notices that that's not correct. Indeed, Presiding Officer, at times it's become hard to know if John Swinney has even started to believe his own spin. Take, for example, the claim that the recent drop in higher passes was just annual variation, when for absolute clarity the pass rate in 2015 was 79.2%, The pass rate in 2016 was 77.2%. The pass rate in 2017 was 77%. The pass rate in 2018 was 76.8%. And the pass rate in 2019 was just 74.8%. While, of course, these figures do show a variation year to year, the thing that screams out to anyone who wants to see the facts is that there is a clear downward trend. Yep. Under the old system, some years the pass rate was up, some years the pass rate was down, but what it didn't do was drop consistently year after year after year. And I think it is a pretty sorry state of affairs when the man who used to run this country's finances can come out and try and pretend that that is not a problem. He can come out and say that there isn't a trend. I think there clearly is, and it's pretty depressing. The Cabinet Secretary for Education can't identify a depressing line on a graph for what it is. Mr Swinney was lucky enough, like me, to go to school in Scotland when there wasn't a shortage of maths teachers. So surely, rather than trying to peddle out some linguistic gymnastics, the least our hard-working teachers and pupils and their parents deserve is the truth. Instead, like on every single issue raised today by opposition members, from subject choice to teacher numbers, from multi-level teaching to additional support needs, from issues we've raised in this chamber recently on music tuition to support for small rural schools, all we get is dither, delay and denial and the blame for actually asking serious questions. Then, when the Cabinet Secretary is dragged kicking and screaming into this chamber, or he's embarrassed by another unanimous damning Education Committee report, then he tries a different approach of offering a series of excuses and lengthy explanations and the promise of debates sometime in the future. And he hopes that by kicking the can a little bit further down the road, he won't have to take responsibility for the fact that his government has been in charge throughout this whole period. And even his own colleagues are starting to get restless. Some do raise a number of them clearly are getting restless today because they don't like to hear it. But if they'd been in for Bob Doris's contribution, they would have seen that there are sensible voices within their own party who are willing to question, at least round the edges, and again, as Rona Mackay did at the end of her speech, whether or not everything is just as rosy and as perfect as we like. There are other members who I know see these issues in their own community, but feel out of a sense of party loyalty that they can't raise the issues in public. And while that's disappointing, it's at least understandable. Yes, certainly.
Bob Doris.
I thank the member for giving me. It was the sensible voice that he was drawn attention to from the SNP benches. The crux of what I was saying is we should use that senior phase review to test what is working well, to make improvements. I take it on that basis you've supported the government amendment and backing the government position here this evening.
Oliver Mundell.
I won't do that, and I'll do it exactly for some of the points that Bob Doris himself raised, because I think we need to look at the broad general education as well, because, as he said, some of the decisions around the senior phase start much earlier on in school, and it takes a long pathway before we can make those changes later on, certainly.
Bob Doris.
Mr Mundell's absolutely right. The expression I used is the senior phase review should look at the connectivity with the lower schools. So do you agree with me you can now support the government amendment as long as that connectivity is examined?
Oliver Mundell.
Well, I've had too many experiences in this chamber of hearing one thing promised by the Cabinet Secretary and then another thing in reality. And I did welcome his commitment today, for example, to publish the report on the higher pass rate. But note with caution, members, it was a promise to publish partial information rather than the full report. And if he wants to publish the full report, I'd be very happy to take an intervention to confirm that. But he's not going to bother. There we go. So we then have other members who do blame the Cabinet Secretary and who also try and blame local government. And then, of course, there's our favourite, as we've heard from Murdo Fraser, those SNP politicians who would just rather rubbish internationally accepted PISA scores. And that's because, of course, in SNP Scotland, absolutely nothing could be wrong. And I think what's most worrying for me is even if you do accept some crazy view that PISA is a crude measure, If it shows a problem, surely that would be worth investigating. And what I find more embarrassing still is that anyone in the governing party in Scotland would think that that just somehow is some comparison between us and China or South Korea, rather than the fact that it actually looks at our performance now compared to our past performance. And whilst it does concern me that we're failing to keep pace with other global leaders in education, it worries me more that we're failing to keep pace with ourselves and make progress, and that we're seeing absolutely no evidence of any significant benefit from recent reforms. Today's debate, once again held in opposition party time, a point that's been raised again and again and again, offered the Cabinet Secretary yet another opportunity to hit the reset button, not only in terms of policy, but in terms of building the political consensus required to address the challenges outlined today. Today's motion asks simply for an acknowledgement that all is not well and that reviewing the senior phase in isolation is unlikely to resolve all of the issues identified and raised today. I don't think that, given what we've heard, not just in today's debate, but from educational experts and this Parliament's own Education Committee, that that should be too much to ask for. Of course, it's always possible to paper over the cracks and to try and save face. But the problem for the SNP is that this problem is not going away. You can't say that something is your so-called top priority and then be happy to ignore the facts and allow young people to pay the price for your lack of leadership. Perhaps we've got it all wrong. Perhaps the Cabinet Secretary really is proud of having thousands fewer teachers in Scottish schools. Perhaps he is proud that young people can't take the subjects he wants. Perhaps he's content that core knowledge-based learning is diminished. Perhaps he tells concerned parents in his own constituency, when they come to him with concerns about learning support, that it's okay because we live in a progressive country and that equity and excellence are at least notionally at the heart of our education system. I suppose all this is possible because we have a Cabinet Secretary who's unable to accept the will of the Parliament, which I think we'll see at decision time, who's unable to concede any ground and who doesn't want to hear what members are saying. I'm just worried that that's the same treatment that parents, teachers and pupils get as he travels around the country, and I'd ask him to think again and to reflect on what he's heard today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that concludes the Conservative Party debate on education. Before coming to decision time, our next item is consideration of business motion 20448 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Bureau setting out a business programme. Could I call on the Minister to move this motion?
Moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. And no member has indicated they wish to speak on the motion. The question therefore is that motion 20446 be agreed. Are we agreed? Yes. We are agreed, thank you. The next item is business motion 20447, also in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Bureau setting out the Stage 2 timetable for a bill. Could I call on the Minister to move this motion?
Moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. And again, no one wishes to speak. The question therefore is that motion 20447 be agreed. Are we agreed? Yes. We are agreed, thank you. The next item is consideration of a Parliamentary Bureau motion. Could I ask Graham Day to move motion 20448 on approval of an SSI?
Moved, Presiding Officer. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Could I ask if any member wishes to speak against? Yes. Alison Johnson wishes to speak against this motion. Alison Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Benefit fraud is a serious issue and the Scottish Government are right to put a system in place to combat it, but Greens are abstaining today because we have several concerns. Organisations including Child Poverty Action Group and NHS Services Scotland raised concerns about the ability to require information from any person or organisation, with some exceptions. This is broader than the UK approach, which specifies the type of people and organisations who can be required to give information. The Scottish Government maintains that while a devolved benefit system is still developing, investigatory powers need to be flexible, but it would be better to create only the powers that the Scottish Government knows it needs and ask Parliament for broader powers later, should new benefits be established. The regulations should be more specific about the training authorised officers are required to undertake, given the sensitivity and complexity involved in investigating fraud. Inclusion Scotland and others raised this concern during the consultation. We've also expressed concerns that not everyone who is investigated will be informed that they have been investigated, which hinders their right to complain. Given these concerns, Greens are not able to support the regulations at the moment and will abstain.
Thank you. And could I ask the Cabinet Secretary Shirley Ann Somerville to respond for the Government?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. These regulations, as drafted, are proportionate and are necessary. They allow information gathering to differentiate between those who make genuine errors and those seeking assistance that they are not entitled to in the most efficient way possible. We have worked closely with our stakeholders to understand the issues raised in the consultation and have amended the regulations accordingly. We comply with all relevant data protection legislation and believe we have addressed the points raised by the Information Commissioner in their consultation response. On balance, we feel the unintended consequences of telling every client of an investigation, particularly when there are cases where no evidence of fraud was found, would lead to worry, distress and would outweigh any benefit. In fact, in doing so, it may indeed increase the number of vexatious allegations that are made. The privacy notice informs clients in advance who data will be shared with, and that data may be collected for the prevention, investigation, detection or prosecution of criminal offences. If an individual makes a subject access request after an investigation is closed, information relating to an investigation would be released where it did not prejudice ongoing proceedings. When developing the regulations, a list of organisations from whom information could be acquired was considered, but was rejected for a number of reasons. Firstly, we are in the process of developing the social security system. Detailed eligibility criteria for those benefits is unknown at this time. Social Security Scotland must be able to respond swiftly to new methods and types of fraud, and waiting for additional organisations to be added or removed from a list would impact upon our ability to do so. Secondly, we engaged with many other government agencies and local authorities, and a number of them noted their efforts to tackle fraud are hampered by a lack of statutory information gathering powers. As I set out to committee, we will review these regulations after a period of 2 years in operation, and if the review indicates that a discrete list would be more appropriate at that time, then such a list could be created. Information will always be gathered by trained professionals with the appropriate skills, and they will proceed with the presumption of innocence in all cases. Counter-fraud officers will work towards meeting the standards within the new government counter-fraud profession, which sets a common set of professional standards and competencies for employees of public bodies investigating fraud. The regulations restrict the pool of staff who can obtain sensitive information and ensure that only those who are authorised can exercise the powers. Authorisation can be withdrawn at any time where an officer is found to have fallen short of those high standards required. Fraud investigators will have to satisfy authorised officers that requests for information are both necessary and proportionate before they will be approved, and this serves as a safeguard against misuse of the information gathering powers. And we welcome the Social Security Committee's recommendation that these regulations be approved by Parliament today.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. The question on this motion will be put at decision time, to which we now turn. The first question, though, is that Amendment 20415.3, in the name of John Swinney, which seeks to amend Motion 20415 in the name of Liz Smith on education, be agreed. Are we agreed? Yes. Or not agreed? We'll move to a vote, and members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 20415.3 in the name of John Swinney is yes 60, no 63. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. The next question is that amendment 20415.2 in the name of Ian Gray, which seeks to amend the motion in the name of Liz Smith, be agreed. Are we agreed? No. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote on this amendment. The result of the vote on amendment number 20415.2 in the name of Ian Gray is yes 63, no 60. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed. The next question is that motion 20415 in the name of Liz Smith as amended on education be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote on the Liz Smith motion as amended. The result of the vote on motion 20415 in the name of Liz Smith as amended is yes 63, no 60. There were no abstentions. The motion as amended is therefore agreed. The final question today is that motion 20448 in the name of Graham Day on approval of an SSI be agreed. Are we agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote. Members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion 20448 in the name of Graham Day is yes 117, no 6, yes 117, there were no votes against and there were 6 abstentions. The motion is therefore agreed. And that concludes the decision time. We're going to move shortly to members' business in the name of John Finney on celebrating Scotland's wetlands on World Wetlands Day 2020. We'll just take a few moments for members and the Minister to change seats. Just a pause.